So welcome everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Dharawal and the Gundagara people of the lands where I live and work, and acknowledge that their ancestors have been the traditional owners of their lands for tens of thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are here today. I'd also like to acknowledge that in the age of Zoom, we are located across many Aboriginal lands here in Australia, and I'd ask you to pay respect to their custodianship and care of these lands wherever you're located today. I'd also like to note that this land was taken from them without their consent, treaty or compensation. I'd like to acknowledge the members of the audience actually out there. We've got hundreds who are attending here today from across the globe. And we're very humbled by your interest and presence here today. I'd also like to thank the speakers and the panelists, which you can see on the screen here, especially for their generosity, I think, in giving their time and knowledge to this topic today. And in particular, I want to thank Beruz, Alison and Anne, who are zooming in from very different time zones. So we appreciate you putting this effort in. I'd also like to acknowledge the incredible support received from our partners for this event. So the Challenging Racism Project and the Diversity and Human Rights Research Centre here at Western Sydney University. They're two key research bodies that do amazing work on racism, human rights and diversity in Australian society. And I'd also like to thank Academics for Refugees. It's a fantastic network of scholars working to achieve human rights and for refugees and asylum seekers. Linda and I co-convening this event. Of course, we're located at Western Sydney University, and I'd just like to thank the university and specifically our school, the School of Social Sciences, for the ongoing support of our work in this space as well. And I just want to very quickly thank Linda as my co-convener of this event. She's got decades of knowledge and skill and activism that she brings to this topic, and it's actually been an absolute delight organising this symposium with her. So thank you, Linda. So just before I do quick introduction remarks, there's a couple of administrative points I want to point out, particularly to our audience members out there. So the event is being recorded and it will be made available after the event. The structure of the event very loosely is Alison will give us a keynote for approximately 30 minutes. We're going to hear from the 7 speakers, which will go for a little bit over an hour. We'll then move into a panel discussion for about 45 minutes and we'll end with a Q&A session at the end. As audience members, you can submit your questions to the Q&A session through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom, should be at the bottom of your screen. I apologise in advance. Like I said, there's hundreds of people attending today, so we're probably not going to get, well, we definitely won't get to all the questions that you potentially pose, but we'll do our best to try and cover as many off as we can. We've also got the chat function available should people want to discuss. So that also is at the bottom of your screen, but please note that we'll only be answering questions that are submitted through the Q&A function. And that's just a logistical thing to make sure we can manage that. I'd also like to point out that we're potentially developing a policy paper out of this symposium, and we'd really like to encourage anyone participating in the audience today to contribute to that ideas to that policy paper. I'm going to put the ways that you can do that up into the chat function shortly. So please contribute via that. And we're keen to get as many ideas and contributions into that policy paper as we can. So I really encourage you to contribute to that. There's also a Twitter hashtag for the event, should anyone like to live tweet. That's hashtag POSA2020. So hashtag POSA 2020. I'm going to keep introduction remarks very short because I know everyone's here to hear this amazing lineup of speakers and panelists, but I just thought I'd give a little bit of context to what we've tried to organise today. So when Linda and I first started discussing this symposium, which was well over a year ago now, and I guess in somewhat different world and time actually to where we are now, we were looking to build on a significant body of work that already exists around Australia's offshore detention practices and its treatment of asylum seekers. And we decided on the broad theme of politicisation of seeking asylum because it spoke to the very deliberate and calculated approach governments have taken towards those seeking asylum, not only here in Australia, but also globally. It's in Australia anyway, a hardline, punitive, dehumanising approach that has widespread public support here. So we believe that this issue is a multifaceted one, and it does and will require a multi-pronged approach. And so we've got speakers here today from a range of disciplines. We've got political science, geography, law, sociology, social work, criminology, and they often work, I think, in interdisciplinary ways as well to bring all those knowledges to the problem. So we found ourselves contemplating a question of what are the systems, the structures, the mechanisms that have brought us to this point. And I think it's an important question for Australian society to contemplate, inclusive, of course, of our political leaders. As Behrouz has pointed out many times in his writing on Manus prison theory, Manus is merely a reflection of the systems and structures in Australia, and we can see it replicated in some ways in our hospitals, our education institutions, our enforcement agencies, among many others. COVID has shown us that while marginalised groups have experienced new sets of challenges, it's also exacerbated their existing vulnerabilities. So we've seen this in how the government has treated international students, temporary workers, those in aged care facilities, and of course, refugees and asylum seekers. So what does this tell us about what we imagine Australia is or could be? As many of our speakers will point out, this is perhaps not something we have become, but something we've always been. And this is an important recognition, I think, if we are to create a different system, a political approach to refugees and asylum seekers in Australia, but also globally. So that's a context, and I think we should begin proper now. And so I'd like to introduce, first up, our keynote speaker, which is Alison Mount. So Alison is a professor in Canada, research chair in global migration at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. Her recent research includes the search for safe haven and erosion of access to political asylum and related struggles over detention. She examines border enforcement and human migration, legal geographies and territoriality. She works on the Island Detention Project, which studies the role of islands and border enforcement off the shores of Australia, Europe and North America. And I will hand over to you now, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just sharing my screen and then going. Okay. I want to begin by saying thank you to Rachel and Linda for the invitation to enter into conversation with scholars whose work I've been reading for years and really admire, and for the opportunity to talk to all of the people that we won't have the chance to see, but who are joining us from around the world. I also want to acknowledge the strangeness of this experience, the moment that we're in. And often we talk about mobility as a privilege. And in this moment, there's a certain immobility and ability to shelter at home and be connected. That is also a privilege that I am enjoying right now, with the ability to be here. I want to tell you all also that I have two small kids who are around because I am in Canada and it is close to their bedtime. So who knows what the next half hour will bring. Adding to the land acknowledgement that Rachel began from where she was speaking, I want to say that I work on the traditional territories and also live on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Neutral, and Haudenosaunee people, as well as the Credit, Chippewa, and Wendat Indigenous groups. And these land acknowledgements are so important when we're talking about contemporary geographies of migration, particularly around displacement and detention. Because the settler colonial state was built on dispossession and displacement. And so there are such important connections for us to draw around the spatial logics and the racialized containment and confinement of people. And I think that's such important writing that's happening right now around the world, but particularly in the context of Australia and Pacific Islands, and part of the approach of the Manus prison theory that we're here to engage, that seeks to map and dissemble colonial relations. So my talk really follows the title that I've offered. I'm going to talk about the death of asylum and asylum's afterlives, and hopefully end on a slightly more hopeful note, now realizing that I did not unplug the telephone. Sorry. Okay, hi. So I actually want to begin closer to home, to where I am right now in North America, before talking about Australia a little bit, to say that, to show you this image, this iconic image of the border between the nation states that we now know as Mexico and the United States. And of course, the image is iconic because it shows us the fence, or what President Trump imagines as the wall. And I start here because it reminds us where border studies has traveled. That border studies has challenged the idea that the border is a line on the map, and in fact finds that bordering practices are much more geographically expansive. I also start here to go back to the work of the scholar Gloria Anzaldúa, who really, with her seminal text, Borderlands La Frontera, published in 1987, I think foresaw so many of the trends that we write about, the important things that we study as border scholars, the proliferation of borders, their corporeality, how they're lived on the body, the ways that they create dualities and divide people, the ways that they are violent and involved in displacement and dispossession. So as a Chicana woman, she was really born in the borderlands and wrote about a decolonial approach. And I think there are important connections to draw between Anzaldúa's work and monist prison theory, which I'm hoping to do a little bit of tonight, this morning. So I think also channeling Nick DiGenova's work, there's often the spectacle of enforcement at land borders, in part because I think they can dominate conversation about migration, particularly in North American contexts, because groups or populations who live on mainland territory have a better chance of actually seeing the land border, or at least seeing what's happening there in the news. And what happens is that the spectacle of what's going on there, of course, obscures other important underlying relationships that are hidden from view. So the noise of enforcement obscures other things. In the case of this border, in the US context, so often discourse about migration is so dominated by the phrase illegality or unauthorized migration. And it really obscures what's happening around the politics of asylum, which is driving so much policy and enforcement along this border right now. In other national contexts, I think discourses about borders obscure other relationships that we can talk about. So land borders and borders at sea, and this is a photograph of a boat approaching Christmas Island, taken in 2010 by Kate Coddington. They really are the spectacle of enforcement that is doing really productive work to call our attention to certain things and hide others from view. And in our book, Boats, Borders, and Bases, my co-author Jenna Lloyd and I argue that the US-Mexico border dominates conversation and also the geographical imagination of migration, of border enforcement, of detention, of so many discussions in the US context. And it distracts our attention away from an important history, which has to do with maritime enforcement offshore in the Caribbean. So particularly in the 1980s and 90s. And in archival research, we found that anti-Black racism really drove US development of offshore policing in the Caribbean and the development of onshore detention. So often people think of the US detention system as being tied to the US-Mexico border in some way, but in fact, there was a history of interception of Haitian and Cuban nationals traveling to the US. They were detained, many of them, at the Crone Detention Center in Florida, where there was overcrowding, poor conditions, protests inside and outside of the facility, and eventually people were transferred to other places. And our book details a lot of these citing battles over where people would be transferred. And what we found is that these early enforcement practices, both onshore and offshore, across bases, naval bases, US bases in the Caribbean, most notoriously Guantanamo Bay, were developing at the same time. And we found that these were operating on a continuum simultaneously, that they formed the grounds for the construction of the largest detention system in the world, that we can think about their continuity over time, that this was an intense period of the politicization of asylum and also the criminalization of asylum seekers that intensified throughout the 1990s, worse after 9/11 and so on. And that this development of practices that the US started in the Caribbean would be exported to other parts of the world, would be taken up by Australia, and other scholars have made this argument. So really we have to go back to these roots in anti-Black racism and to draw out these connections, because history repeats itself. And we find ourselves now in the midst of another moment of intense politicization of asylum, where of course states are using geography to prevent people from accessing the right to seek asylum that they accrue when they land on sovereign territory of a state that is a signatory to the convention state relating to the status of refugees. Rachel mentioned the Island Detention Project, which is a project that I led for several years. And as a geographer in this project, I was really interested in mapping an empirical phenomenon and a spatial pattern. Why were detention facilities being built on islands? And this is not an exhaustive map, but a map that is a reminder that islands are located in sites of crossing, where boat migration becomes highly politicized. And we know, of course, that islands are put to use by states as a way to distance and detach people from the resources they may access in their aspired for destinations where people are on their way to seek asylum. And what we see in the borderlands are the convergence of three empirical trends that are happening globally. First is the global rise in claims. So by 2019, there were about 3.5 million people awaiting the adjudication of their claims. At the same time that the world is experiencing the highest rates of displacement historically, there's also a global growth in detention, obviously not just on highlands. And all of this is also bound up with externalization of borders, their movement offshore, the offshoring of asylum processing. Now, many people have been studying what Leanne Weber and Sharon Pickering call border deaths. And in an Australian context, you'll be familiar with the Border Observatory, the CivX website. There's so many projects doing this macabre and horrible work. And I put up this graph because it comes from a small research project that I did with Kira Williams, where we did a statistical analysis of investments in offshore border enforcement and in statistical analysis of deaths at sea. And what we found was a very strong correlation between investments in enforcement and border deaths. And this is something that people doing qualitative research know, people who have experienced boat migration and detention know that enforcement renders people more precarious. So this is empirical evidence that is out there. I think this is a debate that is over. We know that offshore enforcement and detention are violent and harmful, that they render people more precarious. And yet these are politically popular practices. There is not political will, unfortunately, to hear this evidence. Or to quote Sharon Pickering's piece in The Conversation some years ago, her title said it all. There's no evidence that asylum seeker deterrence policy works, and yet it continues, as does the expansion of detention globally, also designed with deterrence in mind. This is a map from the Global Detention Project, and what I think I want to point out here is that the borderlands, sites of crossing, these are places where that growth is happening, especially. And I think there's no more powerful evidence of the fact that deterrence is a failed policy and a harmful policy than the individual histories and stories of people on the move who travel by boat, to invest incredible resources in trying to get somewhere where they can make a claim for asylum. And this map is one individual journey based on interviews that we did with a man we met from Afghanistan, who at the time was in the Perth detention facility, but who had spent several years, 7 years, and 4 different journeys trying to get to Australia, the dotted lines showing his deportation, and the solid lines showing his movement towards Australia. And so it's important to recognize that these transnational journeys now go on for years, involve crossing multiple borders, and spending time often in being confined, being detained in multiple national contexts. So if the spatial metaphor of the border or approaching or crossing the border was ever that of crossing a line, I think we now need to think about the spatial metaphor of the border as itself a space of confinement or an island, that the process of crossing involves multiple periods of confinement. Why is this happening? We know lots of reasons why this is happening, many of them tied to the geographical imagination and the idea that people can somehow be isolated, detached, or disappeared, which is why I think work by Behrooz Bhusani and by Arash Sarvastani, for example, their film Choka, Please Tell Us the Time, and all of Behrouz's writing is so important because it acts to counter this attempt to disappear people by using the power of language and the power of art and technology to tell stories and to expose these attempted disappearances and the violence being enacted there. So this spatial pattern repeats itself in many regions: the geographical spread of the border, the conversion of islands from spaces of passage or safe haven to carceral spaces, where the capacity to detain grows, where borders and spaces of isolation proliferate. And I think it's really important, that's a really important finding of the research on islands, which is that it's not just detention facility on an island, but there are myriad, multiple ways in which people are divided and separated, even within small spaces of detention. And all of this bordering, as Behrouz shows in his work, is premised on the work of dividing people that borders do, premised on racism and fear and dehumanization and distancing. What does this look like on a map? For those of you in Australian context, I'm not going to go into details here because you know these histories, that much of this begins in Australia with the MV Tampa incident in 2001 and the use of islands on which to detain people and mediate their access to asylum. But this is what this looks like, the proliferation of these spaces of isolation. Just to give some examples, after the Christmas Island high security detention facility was built on Northwest Point, the site was renovated to add cells of solitary confinement. So we have within this facility an island within an island within an island. In Choka, Please Tell Us the Time, that is a film about Choka and the separation of people for their punishment and torture. So this constant proliferation of isolation. And I think this is really present in Behrouz's writing as well. The ways that Manas mirrors Australian society, as Rachel mentioned, and in Omid's writing, and I'm going to quote it here, I love this quote. The first island is the settler colonial state called Australia, and the prisoners are the settlers. The second island contains Manas prison, and knowledge resides there with incarcerated refugees. So we see, I think, many writers grappling with this proliferation of forms of confinement, whether they're writing about hotspots or detention facilities. As this enforcement spreads across the region, in the case of Australia, through all manner of bilateral arrangements and deals, we see the spread of detention in various places. So when I started writing about island detention, I was often writing using language like the erosion of asylum or the shrinking of paths to asylum. But over time, as the infrastructure grew and things became, I would say, more extreme and more people were dying and more states were taking up this effort to use islands to detain, I started to strengthen my argument to write about the death of asylum in conversation with other scholars, such as Lisa Cacho, writing about social death. And what does this intensification look like? Well, again, other scholars have mapped these mobilities, but the export of those policies at sea from the US to Pacific Island territories where the US detains people. So we did research on Guam and Saipan for the Island Detention Project. They're exported to Australia. Australia exports to Europe. And on this goes. So this is a map of Bangladesh's buildup of the Silt Island Bazan Char for the movement of Rohingya refugees from Cox's Bazar. Very controversial because it's in the path of cyclones. Denmark in December 2019 decides to import Manas and Nauru models to convert a facility on a small island near Copenhagen. And most recently, it's revealed that the UK Home Office was considering detention on St. Helena and Ascension Island. So this is not over. This empirical phenomenon, that's one where I began, this island detention and this obsession with keeping people, incarcerating people offshore. What I argue in the book is that, and here I really engage island studies scholars, many of whom argue that we have to move islands from the periphery to the center of our understandings of all kinds of things, such as the development of nation states and sovereignty and bordering. And I argue that we need to move them to the center of our understanding of global migration, because they portend the fate of asylum and they portend what's happening elsewhere. And here again, it's that movement between what's happening offshore and onshore and how they're always interrelated. The book actually opens with an obituary for asylum, engaging Judith Butler's argument that an obituary allows for the public distribution of grief. And I argue that the death of asylum has three parts. The first, of course, is physical, and there is tragic physical death all around. This is an image of the small memorial on Christmas Island built for the Civ X, the boat that sank in 2001, very controversial. Again, I'm not going into the details, but those of you who live in Australia will know that there are memorials across Australia for the Civ X. But it's not only the physical deaths of people, it's also the ontological death of the possibility of even inhabiting this category of becoming an asylum seeker because of all of the offshoring that is happening. And then the political death, which is to say the absence of political will to end these policies. Now, there are people fighting the death of asylum, and there's a chapter in the book that's all about activist movements and how they're fighting to counter the isolation and distance of asylum. But I think it's important to think about what it is that is ending and what this means. Many human rights reports, so much research over the years has found that the more remote the detention, and the longer a person is detained, the more harmful this becomes to them, to their mental health, to their physical well-being. Much of that research is actually coming out of Australia. And yet, as I said, these practices continue. So I've been thinking more and more about asylum's afterlives. What is the afterlife of state protection when asylum is no longer accessible, when asylum as we know it ends? What does this moment of the politicization of asylum offer us? And here I'm following Christina Sharp's call to understand, she writes about understanding life in the wake of transatlantic slavery and the ways that that historical migration overshadows Black contemporary life in so many ways. And so I want us to think about island detention and how we can place it historically, what has come before and what has come after. How does the colonial past operate in the colonial present? And I understand many scholars to be doing exactly this work, including, for example, Katerina Taewa, who writes about the sedimentation of colonial relations and the grounds of exploitation of island communities and economies that these engender. I think these are questions that Claire Lonin and Maria Giannakopoulos raise in their work about what they call essentially the non-closure of detention facilities and the ways that these detention practices repeat colonial forms of violence. And in the work of Beyrouche and Omid, who also write about colonial histories and how we need to think through monist prison theory about interlocking forms, related forms of domination and violence. So I think I want to just point to a few ways that I'm thinking right now about asylum's afterlives, and then I will wrap up. The first is that island detention itself is an afterlife of asylum. It was never meant to be a robust processing or fair hearing of asylum claims. That is not what those facilities were set up for, in spite of the fact that they, like border enforcement at sea, are sometimes narrated as rescue, as in humanitarian terms. In fact, they prolong people's limbo and uncertainty. They are spaces of incredible violence and harm that has been so well documented. They are built on colonial grounds. And what we see there is the state essentially receding or retracting asylum and leaving something else in its place. And one of the things that's left in its place are deals, right? So deals, swaps, trades that Kristen McConaughey writes about in her 2017 paper, and that are relevant right now in terms of the resettlement of people from Manus and Nauru. So these deals are one set of geopolitical arrangements that are standing in for durable solutions. These are not, they're ad hoc, highly politicized deals between states. And I think they're a very cynical way of treating people, of resettling people. So most infamously, I think, or most pressing for our conversation today, I should say, is the 2016 deal that President Obama signed with Malcolm Turnbull right before he left office. So I want to talk briefly about that. And then I'll talk briefly about intimate geopolitics as a third part of asylum's afterlives. So this is what Trump, when he came into office, called the dumb deal, infamously. And that was, part of his call with Turnbull, which is a transcript that was released by The Guardian. And in spite of him having called this trade a dumb deal, it's been honored. So the trade, which is not public, but which Ann Richard, one of its architects, and the former US Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration in Homeland Security, she's written about this and spoken about this. And the idea was that Australia would resettle somewhere between 20 and 50 Central American asylees sent by the US, and the US would resettle up to 1,200 people who had been determined to be convention refugees from Manus and Nauru. And it's a fascinating political moment right now that this has quietly gone through in the US, with over 700 people resettled as of this year. At the exact moment when the US is bringing its refugee resettlement numbers down to historic lows since the implementation of refugee law in the United States, and including during the pandemic. This has continued. So people were first flown, the first flight was in September of 2017, and then it continued. These deals have been heavily criticized for enabling and affirming the offshoring and the shirking of commitments to international law being carried out by the states that are signatories to the convention. They're criticized in all kinds of ways. And they, I think, advance the premise of deterrence, right? They're still premised on the idea that people are recognized to be refugees, but not desired in the countries that are carrying out the offshoring. And so the idea is that people still can't make it to the place that they were trying to get to claim asylum. And the idea is to discourage others, to continue to discourage others from trying. Interestingly, here in Canada, there's a movement afoot led by Australian immigrants who are here using Canada's private sponsorship model to bring refugees from Papua New Guinea, from Manus and from Nauru to Canada in much smaller numbers. And that's also an experimental kind of policy that's been getting a lot of attention internationally, that other countries are looking at. The idea being that residents can get together and pool financial resources to sponsor people for a year. So it's a fascinating moment to look at how we are politically and geopolitically connected across all of these regions in interesting ways, and to think through what it means for someone who might have been displaced from home because of the imperial actions of the United States government in their home country, tries to get to Australia and then finds themselves traded to be resettled in the very United States. So these are the kinds of ad hoc, informal, interesting things to think through, not necessarily what we would think of as durable solutions. This is just a graph showing this movement, and you can see the departures to the US when this was created in June 2020 as 619. And Beirut, forgive me for showing you in a snapshot from your film. Choka, please tell us the time. But I show this image because I think the third afterlife that we need to think about is the afterlife of asylum for those who've experienced island detention. And I include both islanders and island communities and people who have been detained on islands here, building on your writing, Beirut, because I think there's this whole body of work going on now by people like my colleague Sarah Turnbull and others on post-deportation and what happens to people when they get out. And how do they deal with this experience, these experiences, and how does racialized violence and separation of families live on over time and across generations? What will this mean over time, and what will it mean for island communities that were overtaken for a while by the detention industry when the detention industry departs? Feminist political geographers would write about this as intimate geopolitics, the idea that geopolitics are not something out there and abstract, but something that is, they're lived. These relationships are lived in day-to-day life. And so that is a third and important part of the afterlife of asylum. The last afterlife of asylum that I want to think through to engage our important theory that we're talking about today is Manus prison theory itself. What kind of afterlife of asylum does Manus prison theory offer us? And Manus prison theory really inspires me to ask what political opportunities we can find in the afterlife of a system that was organized by states and Western liberal democracies who defined human rights, and to draw on Judith Butler, determined who gets to count as human, right? So as Hannah Arendt wrote long ago, this was always a problematic setup, wasn't it? That a community of states would have to be willing to implement this very system that they designed. So I wonder, and I ask my colleagues, whether we should lament the death of asylum or whether we should be fighting for something else. And personally, I find hope in art, in activism, and in talk of abolition. And I think the pandemic offers us a moment to consider the disruption that we're seeing. And there have been calls for abolition, and I know that we're going to be talking about that today. So just to wrap up, I really began as a border studies student of Gloria Anzaldua's, and now I want to be the border studies scholar that is engaged with and learning from Behrouz Booshani's work and Omid Tofighian's work. And I think there are really important connections across these texts. Writing by people who are beginning this writing in the borderlands, who emerge from violent journeys with incredibly powerful creative work, who use language and the creative process as forms of witnessing and healing and empowerment. And I think there is what they call relational reinforcement across these texts and their decolonial approaches. And so I want to respond to the call that Mana's prison theory offers, the open call, the fluid border call for ways of connecting forms of violence and domination, to join what Omid writes is an intellectual and political project for the purposes of truth-telling and transformation. I want to follow in Behrouz's footsteps to break the boundaries that divide people, and in the invitation to disrupt and dismantle the global detention industry through borderless collegiality. I say yes. So my only question to my colleagues is, what next? Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That is such a fabulous setup, I think, for an amazing discussion that is going to continue on now. I'm going to just move really quickly now to, we have 7 speakers that we're going to run through now. And I'm going to, I sort of set this up at the beginning, but I'm just going to introduce everyone in one go now, and then we'll just roll each speaker out one after the other. So I just want to begin with welcoming Omid and Behrouz, who will be our first speakers in this session. Behrouz is a Kurdish Iranian journalist, human rights defender, writer, and film producer. He was previously held in detention on Manus Island. He's a senior adjunct research fellow at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand now, and Behrouz is, of course, the author of the award-winning book No Friend But the Mountains. So welcome, Behrouz. I'm glad you could join us here today. And Omid and Behrouz is going to talk together. Omid is a lecturer, researcher, and community advocate, combining philosophy with interests in rhetoric, religion, popular culture, transnationalism, displacement, and discrimination. He contributes to community arts and cultural projects, works with asylum seekers, refugees, and young people from Western Sydney. Omid also is the translator of Behrouz's book, No Friend But the Mountains. Behrouz and Omid will be followed by Anne McNevin, Associate Professor of Politics at the New School for Social Research in New York. Anne's research focuses broadly on the transformation of citizenship and sovereignty, the regulation of borders and migration, and spatial and temporal dimensions of world politics. Anne will be followed by Andrew Burridge. Andrew is a political geographer based in the Department of Geography and Planning at Macquarie University. Andrew's work is focused primarily upon undocumented migration, the effects of border securitization and immigration detention, as well as asylum and refugee reception and settlement. Welcome, Andrew. Followed by Maria Giannakopoulos, is a senior lecturer at in socio-legal studies in the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University in Adelaide. Maria undertakes critical interdisciplinary research in the areas of sovereignty, colonialism, austerity, and borders. Claire Loughnan is a lecturer in criminology at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Claire's research interests are in border protection, immigration detention, and the modes, practices, and effects of spaces of confinement and control. Welcome, Claire. And finally, but not least, Julie Mackin has worked as a documentary film writer and senior writer with the Australian Financial Review. She's worked as a political and media consultant to the Federal Labor and New South Wales Greens, and has worked in media for Greenpeace and ActionAid. And she's currently undertaking a doctorate at Western Sydney University on how Australia became a nation that tortures. So we'll move into this session now with the speakers, and I'll invite Omid and Buruz to begin.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Linda, for organising this and for inviting us. Behruz, I'll give you space to begin the conversation on Manus prison theory, and then I'll follow up. And thank you, everyone, for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Actually, Alison, I got a great energy from Alison. That now this Manus prison theory and the whole policy is really is following by the academics around the world, which is great in this level. It was remarkable. Just I would like to mention something about today, following what Alison said. That right now that I'm talking with you today, I mean, some of the Australian advocates, and they are in front of the parliament in Australia right now in Canberra with some of the Green MPs. So now they are delivering 60,000 signatures by the Australian people, and they to ask the government to accept the New Zealand offer. So it means that it's possible that New Zealand, now that they passed the election, they accept this offer. So that is just for information. Another thing is that some of the refugees were transferred to, I think 6 or 7 people were transferred to France. I mean, from Port Moresby, 2 to France, 2 to Finland, and 1 to UK. And now some of them are waiting to be transferred to Finland. So it's not only Canada and America, just some people were transferred to those countries. And they did this through United Nations. So now United Nations, UNHCR, has a small role to transfer some of the refugees. But I don't think that they transfer many, just it will be 10 people, 12 people. And also regarding the Manus Island, that Alison mentioned about the local people, I think it's very important that we really study that and do some research about that how this policy impacts negatively on that island and on Nauru Island. I think that the balance in those islands, I mean, in terms of social balance and economical balance, now challenged by this system, because right now the people in Manus Island, they established their economy on base of this policy, on base of the companies who were working there, and suddenly this company disappear and they transfer the refugees to Port Moresby. So it means that for people in Manus Island, at least 10,000 people were directly and indirectly were working with those companies. Now they lost their jobs and they lost their income. And we know that in that island, we have domestic violence and drug using, alcohol, and all of this now it creates a huge problem in that society. And also 40 children remain from the refugees. So who is going to take responsibility for this? I think that is important that we really we study this, we do research about this, because it's not only about the refugees. When we talk about colonialism, we should include those people too. And another thing that Alison mentioned, say that what is the next? I think it's very good that we start our conversation from this point, that right now I and Omid and we are working on some projects, but in these projects we are mostly focused on indigenous people and indigenous struggle in Australia. So we link this struggle and this resistance culture, I mean the indigenous resistance culture, with our work and our resistance. And I think that is very interesting, and we are really hopeful that we, these projects be released soon. One of them is a play, which some of the Australian actors and directors are working on. This play is particularly about the indigenous kids in the custody, but they are adopting some ideas from the book No Front But the Mountains and other works. Other articles that we did. And now I and Omid, we have worked with them, and hopefully they release it on November. I think that is very fundamental work, because we believe that this policy is related to the history of colonialism in Australia. So now it's still, we can say that still we are producing some work to challenge the narrative, to create our language that always we talk about. And another work is a journal that hopefully next month we publish it. And this journal, we invited, we will publish it on based off the project Writing Through Fences, which Janet Galbraith collected writing and artwork by the refugees in Manus Island, Nauru, Australia, and in Indonesia for many years, since 2013. And but I wrote an article about this, which published in the Saturday paper, about the Writing Through Fences project. So now we are publishing some of this work in that journal, but we invited 3 or 4 indigenous writers, such as Lukashenko, Tara Junwinch, and they participated in this work and in this journal, which I think is very important. So we can say that we will publish this journal, which include the refugees work and the indigenous work, and we write about language and the narrative and the role of language and literature and art and creativity. So, and I think that is very important. But we are working on some other projects, but these 2 projects are I think are fundamental. So I give the space to Omid, so we can talk about Manus prison theory.
Thanks, Behruz. That you really set up a lot of the ideas and a lot of the projects that I wanted to talk about now. And also thank you to Alison for particularly mentioning the thought experiment, the very short tale or example that I bring in in the essay at the end of No Friend But the Mountains, after the novel. that particular thought experiment grew out of the very first conversations that Behrooz and I were having about Manus prison theory. And so I'm going to basically respond to the ideas that are manifest in that particular notion and that particular story, and also maybe talk about some of the projects that Behrooz mentioned and why they're important, how they tie in with Manus prison theory. But maybe first, before I do that, I can give some kind of brief overview of Manus prison theory, how it emerged, and also some of the essential or some of the fundamental principles of Manus prison theory. So just very briefly, I should mention that I think it was about 3 months or so into the translation process for No Friend But the Mountains that we first started talking about the idea of Manus prison theory. So it's extremely important that we acknowledge the different forms of resistance that were taking place in the detention center, the different kinds of networks and connections that were created as a result of collaborations and sharing and consultation. It's really important to acknowledge the writing, the creative work, so many different things that have come out of the offshore detention industry, the regime. But I think one thing that has maybe hasn't received the same amount of attention is the intellectual, theoretical, philosophical work that's come out, and we're hoping that now with setups with initiatives like this one and others, that we can start talking about the philosophy behind the resistance, the philosophy behind the interactions, the relationships. And because there is a really coherent theory that ties in the creative work with the political work, and this is something that I think really introduces people who are subject to the border violence in Australia and in other parts of the world as critical thinkers, as philosophers, as knowledge producers, not just as voices, not just as people responding to violence with their bodies, with their spirits, with their creative work, but there's also a very important philosophical dimension to the kind of work that's going on. And as Behrooz mentioned, it's really comprehensive. There's a lot of things coming out in terms of theatre, in terms of literature, and of course in terms of practical political work as well. So, like I mentioned, it was about 3 months into the translation process that we thought to ourselves that there's something happening here. There's something emerging really organically. We didn't actually set out. We didn't plan to create a kind of a theoretical framework for what we were doing. We were basically working on different levels. Everything was so urgent and unpredictable, and there were so many obstacles that we were confronting that we really didn't know how to respond at different times, and we really didn't know exactly what kind of strategy to develop, because everything was so fluid and everything was happening so unexpectedly. Everything was so spontaneous. So at a certain point we thought it's actually in this kind of uncertainty, in this kind of precarious position, in these moments, in these intimate periods where we have to try our hardest to find ways out, to respond to a system that's constantly changing, that's fluid. It was in these particular periods that we thought something is happening, some new way of thinking, some new way of knowing is being produced. And in particular, Behrouz's focus on language, on creating a new language, this inspired so much of our work, because particularly in translation, I was trying to find the right kind of words in English to represent the new language that Behrouz was producing, to try to discuss the system, to try to analyze the system, and of course, transform the system, dismantle the system. So this kind of urgency and this kind of difficulty and perplexity around language really gave rise to Manus prison theory. We basically named it. We thought by naming it, we're one step towards actually creating some kind of coherent, sophisticated foundation for then building on and creating new networks with. The other thing that I think is important is that so much of the translation process for Manus Prisons, for No Friend But the Mountains, involved a lot of sharing and consultation and collaboration. So I refer to it in my translator's note as a shared philosophical activity. And this shared philosophical activity I also discuss as being open-ended. So everyone who actually engages in this particular project, who actually gives feedback, who works with us, who actually creates new connections for us, is part of this shared philosophical activity. And even this panel now, this conference, this symposium, I consider as being part of that shared philosophical activity. So this kind of perpetual knowledge creation, knowledge generation, I think is important, is vital to Manus Prison theory as well. And it's not a kind of theory that's systematic and really kind of closed in terms, or the definitions and the limits of Manus Prison theory aren't like many other theoretical works, especially in philosophy, that are kind of heavily determined by the principles, the concepts, and the methods that are presented at the beginning. This is something that is emerging. It's something that's open. It's something that also crosses boundaries, crosses borders. So it's the theory itself, the way that it's used, the way that it's developed, is also a form of debordering. And what's important as well in terms of debordering is the fact that it reimagines the way academia operates. It pushes through the limits, the boundaries, the expectations, the norms of academic work. So going back to the general principles that I think are important for thinking about in relation to Manus Prison theory is that first of all, the most important thing was to evoke, to describe, to unpack, and also to communicate or convey the technologies of systematic torture. Right from the very beginning, Behruz was really adamant that he wanted his No Friend But the Mountains, his book No Friend But the Mountains, to really describe, to introduce the notion of systematic torture. He thought one of the things that his other work, journalism, maybe even the film, weren't able to do was basically communicate or to really help understand and unpack the way that systematic torture is used, the way it's created. So one of the most important things about Manus Prison theory is the notion of systematic torture and the technologies that allow it to expand and ingrain in different systems and in different relationships. The second one is the chiroarchal system, and how the chiroarchal system is the soul of Manus Prison. So the term that Behruz uses in Farsi is Sistema Hakem, and Hakem has Arabic roots, but it's one of these transnational words that you find used in all Islamic cultures. So Hakem can be translated in so many different ways, and I won't go into the details of the translation, but all the translations that I found for Hakem didn't really quite capture the active role, the kind of insatiable, unrelenting, passionate desire to force people or grind people down into submission. So what terms like oppression, domination, sovereign, controlling, governmental, all of these terms didn't really quite capture that. So I was looking for something that really reflects what Behruz was trying to say, something very particular that he was trying to say in relation to the system in the prison. In terms of Australian border politics. And the only term that I could find that was anywhere close to that was something that I went back to in my earlier studies and earlier work in religious studies, in critical religious studies, and that was the notion of chiroarchy, first introduced by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who is a a radical feminist theologian and philosopher. And this was perfect because the notion of hierarchy was developed by Schussler Fiorenza out of her relationships with Black feminists, Chicana feminists, mujeristas, um, transnational feminist movements. And I would also say that Behruz's influence from Kurdish feminists played a huge role in his the way he worked this notion into his thinking. So all of these were really important to us to really think about a way to communicate the system that Behruz is talking about. And hierarchy was the perfect term. And to give to create a notion, a concept, a language that reflects what Behruz was trying to do in Farsi that was completely new. Sistema hakem is a neologism. It's a completely new phrase. I used hierarchy to create the hierarchical system, which is also a new term, a new phrase. So the other, moving on from that, it was also important for Manus prison theory to address the colonial logic that characterizes and drives border politics. The other idea is the synecdochic or the symmetrical relationship between the border and the nation. And so we often talk about the Manus prison as being an exception, a state of exception. But one of the maybe problems or obstacles we faced in trying to theorize this relationship was that we also argue that Manus prison is part of Australia's history, part of Australian society and politics. They're both deeply embedded in the narrative and the psyche of Australia and of the settler colonial state. So we were trying to overcome this obstacle, and we thought that one of the best ways was to refer to the narrative basis, the narrative epistemology that drives so much of these workings, so much of these forms of violence, and to think about what kind of narrative element or what kind of narrative trope can be used to understand the relationship between the two islands. And rather than think about the relationship in terms of metaphor or metonymy, think about it more in terms of synecdoche, which looks at the relationship as part and whole, the relationship between part and whole. And this part-whole relationship is interchangeable. So sometimes Australia is the whole and Manus prison is the part. Sometimes Manus prison is the whole, Australia becomes the part. So thinking about this relationship as sometimes exceptional, sometimes not. And this is being interchangeable and fluid and constantly or ever changing. So this helps to understand the way that Manus prison can be exceptional and unexceptional at the same time. Moving very quickly, I know we want to move on to the discussion and other talks, but very briefly, the creation and expansion of a pyramidal system of intersecting oppression. So rather than thinking about the oppression as hierarchical, think about it as pyramidal, fostering hate and competition. So it's kind of thinking about the notion of intersubjugation, where people within the system, within this pyramid, actually turn on each other and create new groups, new kind of spaces where new vulnerabilities are abused and exploited, stripping people of identity or personhood and erasing their memories of their values, individuality, and passions. Thinking about the pro-refugee / anti-refugee disposition in the Australian public, thinking about the way that we can all be both pro-refugee and anti-refugee at the same time. And I think this is really important to acknowledge, and something I had to come to terms with as well in terms of my collaborations, that I can also be contributing to the demonization, to the exploitation of refugees in different ways, if I'm not aware, if I'm not challenging the structural element. So being pro-refugee and anti-refugee at the same time was a revelation for me, and something that I've been working towards addressing and transforming, and I think something that should be part of the Manus prison theory discourse. Horrific surrealism as a schema for understanding and interpreting border violence. the use and abuse of language, naming, and tropes for disempowering, but also their subversion and reclaiming for empowerment. So the language, the naming, and the tropes can be also empowering as well as disempowering, if approached through the right kinds of creative political kind of avenues. A place-based analysis and representation, looking at Indigenous knowledge systems and other colonized and system-impacted epistemologies of resistance. And to finish off, I think the other thing that we really want to focus on in terms of managed prison theory that is really important is just considering the ideas of hope, joy, celebration, and pride as political acts, as political notions that we can use to create new spaces, new horizons, new epistemologies, and thinking about the political impact and the political importance of these notions. So and here we find so much, so many resources in No Friend But the Mountains that talk to joy and celebration and pride and hope. And in particular, I'm thinking of Behrouz's use of humor and satire, and how these can be leveraged in really important ways, not just academically, but also in terms of transforming the carceral border archipelago, as we sometimes refer to it, the whole industry. Thank you.
Do I have time to say something?
Yes, please go ahead, Behrouz, that's fine.
Yeah, I think what Omid said is really very important, but I think we should be careful with that we don't reduce when we are talking about the resistance and the resistance through creation, through art. We should don't reduce this resistance to only artworks or to literature or the music, or we should think about this, that when we are talking about resistance, we should talk about the resistance even on base of bodies. I mean, bodies in this context create and produce knowledge, produce philosophy, even with the bodies. So if you look at the pictures, for example, the pictures that you can find them in the internet, you see that the refugees, the detainees in that island are mostly half naked. And you see, you know, for me, it's like a symbol, because their bodies are subject to politics, to power. And that's why even hunger strike or self-harm, all of these, I think, are subject to this resistance, is a subject for this theory that we are talking about. And I think that is very important, that we don't really reduce this theory to only the artwork and this, because sometimes, so in the book, you can see that in the book that I described, Meysam, you know, Meysam or Meysam the Whore is a character that is really, I think, is a central character, that how he challenged the system through satire, through performing, and through, you know, making joke. And I think that is important. That is important. We should go through the life. We should look at the life in that prison, and how people in that island, in that prison, create a space which actually to create a kind of freedom in that circumstances, because we are talking about the system that has a deep desire to take control of everything. And in the book, I would like to refer you to the part that I described, that some of the detainees are when the detainees go to toilets, the guards sit in front of the toilet, and sometimes they knock on the door just to remind them that we are here and we control you, even when you are in the toilet. And I say that toilet, the space there inside the toilet is the most free space in that prison, because when they come out, so there is a camera everywhere, the guards are everywhere, and they control people. And I think that is very important, that we look at this, think about life inside that prison camp. And I think that is the knowledge. That is the knowledge. And doesn't matter when I am talking, so generally what I say, doesn't matter that these refugees write a book, or they sing, or they create artwork. Doesn't matter. What is important is that these detainees, they anything that they create actually challenge the system. And this, when I say creation, it's not only writing an artwork. Sometimes when a detainee is making joke and make his friends laugh, when a detainee is looking after a flower in the corner of the prison, when a detainee looking at the sky and try to see, to get create a connection with the animals, with the natural elements, that is important. We should look at that, this in this way too. So I think, I don't know that we have time or not.
I think that's a really great point. Thank you, Behrooz. And I might
if it's possible, just I say few sentences.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, I would like to refer you to a part of the book that really I myself, I like that part, but I think the readers don't like that part. That part that I talk about the a building which is in behind the prison, and then I imagine another building, then another building, then I imagine a building in somewhere else, out of the island, close to a parliament. I think that is important. So that is the central image when we are talking about Manus prison theory. What is Manus prison theory is that island, that Omid mentioned very well, that and Alison mentioned that this island, Australia as a big island and Manus Island as a small island, that they impact on each other. And Manus Island and that prison is a part of Australia. So in those buildings that I describe, that finally I imagine a building close to the parliament. I think that is the central part of Manus prison theory, that how they impact on each other and how Manus is a part of Australia. And I think, and that's why now we are working with the indigenous people too, because it's relate to each other. And so that's why, yeah, so there are many things to say about this. There are many things really remain that we talk about, but I think, unfortunately, the universities, that is another part of the Manus prison theory in terms of bureaucracy and how they put people through a bureaucratic system to control them, to take their identity and freedom. Unfortunately, the universities are very are like a system which very close to Manus prison system. And the academics in this system are like the detainees, because they control the researchers, they control the academics, and they actually guide them to do research about something that they want. And they do it through granting. So that's why, unfortunately, the academics, the researchers are not free enough to do research about this. And now I call it that our universities are lazy, but really the researchers are not lazy. Those people who are managing this system, they are controlling this system. I mean, the bosses that we don't know who are they are, yeah, leading this system. And that's why now, after many years, really still manus naro and hold this policy is not really a big part of the research and study in Australia and other countries. Just we are, I think that is my understanding, that just we are some people who are working in this field.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Behrooz. You too, Omid. I think that's a great set of topics and issues like for discussion to bring it back to. We might move on to Anne, who's up next, and Behrooz and Omid hopefully can hang around, because I think we'll have more discussion of that like in the panel and the Q&A section at the end as well. But I'll hand over to Anne now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's really an honour to be here talking with this crowd, this whole crowd, all of whom I have learnt a great deal from over the years. You know, I really just want to echo the point that Omid and Behrooz were just making about the philosophical and theoretical content of their work, and the significance of their work at that level. It's something that has really inspired me to think about the politics of asylum in Australia and elsewhere in terms of its durabilities and continuities. And of course, this goes against a lot of the opposition to asylum policies, which so often represents their violence as an aberration from like an otherwise, you know, progressive national and international story of regard for refugees. So their work's been really important in that respect, as has all of the people whose names I've just put on the screen here, people whose work, some of whom are here today, has really influenced me, and has done so much to make that point with respect to Australia's settler colonial past and present, and the continuities between that and all asylum and the politics of asylum. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I just want to signal some lines of inquiry that I'm pursuing around these kinds of things. I've been thinking about a series of passport ceremonies that activist Robbie Thorpe and the late Wiradjuri elder Ray Jackson held between 2010 and 2014, when they presented First Nation passports to asylum seekers detained in Sydney, to the families of refugees who had died offshore, and in absentia to Tamil asylum seekers stuck in Indonesia, and to Palestinian refugees in camps in Gaza and the West Bank. And in a commentary at the time, Ray Jackson declared his disgust with the social and criminal abomination that is being done in our name by our governments, as he put it. And he went on, I don't accept that they have that right to dictate who comes seeking refuge on stolen Aboriginal lands. And I've been thinking about those words and this gesture and the different ways in which it could be read. So most obviously, it's a refusal to endorse the violence done to refugees in our name by our governments, as Ray Jackson put it. It's also a fundamental questioning of who exactly is authorised to extend or deny welcome on account of sovereign authority. So the passports assume and perform Aboriginal sovereignty over unceded land. But I want to resist a reading of this gesture that imputes to it a simple inversion of sovereign authority, as if the nature of sovereignty itself weren't also in question. And here I'm working against some of the arguments made by Nandita Sharma in her recent book, Home Rule, where she argues that Indigenous sovereign claims are not so different from state sovereign claims, in that they rely on imperial category distinctions between native and migrant, and that they rearrange rather than transcend an exclusionary logic of sovereignty. I think this kind of argument misses some of the epistemic issues at stake in the meanings that are attributed to sovereignty. Because, of course, Indigenous scholars and activists have argued that what's at stake in Indigenous relations to land, law, and governance is not reducible to what Eileen Morton-Robinson has called the possessive logics of sovereign territorial state claims. And this can be true even while the language deployed to make Indigenous claims, land, territory, rights, embassies, passports, and even sovereignty itself, deploys the trappings of state authority to make its case. So this language is at least in part designed to be legible and authoritative within the legal systems that prevail. But it seems to me a leap to assume that those words necessarily convey a full expression of concepts and categories for which there may be no equivalent reference points in non-Indigenous languages, legal systems, and life world. So a really helpful account of this problem is given by Robert Nichols in his recent book called Theft is Property. And he develops what he calls recursive dispossession. And this notion, he says, is about how the meaning of the very thing that one can be said to be dispossessed of is always already reduced to a proprietary relation to land, so land as title or possession. And he raises the epistemic means through which one might be able to communicate a more adequate sense of the forms of loss at stake. So taking this into account, the claim to be dispossessed of sovereignty is also a claim to be subject to a kind of epistemic violence that nullifies these non-proprietary forms of sovereignty even as possibilities. So then I've been thinking about other conceptions of sovereignty, and in particular, the work of Palaku writer and lawyer Amberlyn Quaimolina, and her account of what she calls narrative sovereignty. And she points to Aboriginal conceptions of time and space in which it doesn't make sense to distinguish past from present in ways that would separate out original forms of sovereignty from contemporary networks and relationships between humans and non-human entities through which decision-making is established. So she argues that narrative forms of sovereignty would ask very different questions of anyone who would claim to assert authority over land. And the sort of questions they would ask are the following. What are your stories? I'm quoting here. Where is the evidence of your understanding of the networks of living beings that comprise country? How do you understand your place within these networks? Which is to say, can you enumerate the relationships, your relationships, and in so doing, explain both your rights and responsibilities? So the spirit of this kind of narrative exchange strikes me as present in a particular exchange that I want to briefly finish on. And this is an exchange between Behrooz Bhusani and Warramai scholar Victoria Greaves, although to my knowledge, this exchange has only happened on paper. So in a piece in Griffith Review in 2018, Victoria Greaves calls suggested engaging refugees who were detained at the time on Manus Island as parties to a collective refounding of an Australian republic. And her call, of course, followed from a wider Indigenous call for a Makarrata Commission as part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where Makarrata was defined as a coming together after a struggle. And that statement, of course, called for a program of action which included an institutionalised voice to Parliament, truth-telling about collective histories, and a process of treaty making between sovereign peoples as the culmination of that process. Now, in particular, Greaves proposed that Beiruz's letter from Manus Island be read as one of several founding documents of a new Australian Republic. And this is the letter, of course, composed in the context of the Manus prisoners' uprising against their incarceration, and in the context of Beiruz's challenge to Australian people more broadly to reflect on a longer history that created the conditions of possibility for Manus Island prison. So Beiruz's letter was a call for truth-telling about Australia's past and present. But also, I would suggest, it was an extraordinary act of care and regard for those in whose name Manus Prison was authorised. In response to that act, Victoria Greaves then invites Bushani and other refugees to be part of a coming together and to be part of that process in their own words. So on both sides of this exchange, I think we move well away from the possessive logics of exclusive ownership and control over land as territory. We move well away from the kinds of sentiments, especially compassion, that frame humanitarian gestures towards suffering displaced people, be they Indigenous or refugee. And we also move well away from hospitality as a host-guest relation of benevolence and supplication. Both parties to this exchange, it seems to me, are expressing forms of care in a very different register. Care as regard for the perspective of the stranger who has become irrevocably part of us. So I'll just end by saying that for me, these different gestures, the passports, the gesture by Beiruz, the gesture by Victoria Greaves, that all operate at the intersection of displacement and dispossession, offer, I think, very profound ways to think through a reconstructive form of politics in ways that are both genuinely new and long enduring. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That was fabulous. We might just keep moving through if that's okay with everyone. So I'll throw to you now, Andrew.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll just figure out how to share my screen as well, and then we'll be right to go. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on Wadamadugal clan's land of the Darug Nation here at Macquarie University. I'd like to shift a little bit of the discussion from the consideration of offshore detention, which of course is incredibly vital as the work of Omid and Beiruz and many others in understanding this system, but to also think about the ongoing and shifting use of onshore detention in Australia as part of a continuum that certainly that Omid and Beiruz have pointed to. And in particular, to reflect on some previous work I've done whilst based in the UK and the US with some other colleagues of mine, in which we framed these forms of bordering as polymorphic and considering a polymorphous approach to understanding these spaces of bordering and migration control that refuse a homogenizing border logic, but illuminate the fractured partial ways that difference and territoriality are practiced. And with my work with Jenna Lloyd and Matt Mitchelson in Beyond Walls and Cages, considering the inherently multi-scalar projects of detention and imprisonment and thinking through the broader prison and migration industrial complex. Now, for many of you, you will know these figures, but just to recap, the most recent figures for onshore detention in Australia show almost 1,500 persons in some form of closed detention onshore, a further 765 in community detention, and almost 12,500 on bridging visas. Of course, the reopening of Christmas Island has also seen this continuous churn and relocation of persons as well. We now see in excess of 560 days as average time in onshore detention. It should be noted that there's very limited monitoring of detention in Australia, and this is typically government-led by the Commonwealth Ombudsman, for example, which leads to a significant lack of transparency and oversight, much as we've seen offshore. Alison earlier mentioned about the important but very difficult work in documenting deaths, and we know that more than 40 persons have died within onshore detention, including a few more as recent as August of this year. On top of that, even the Department of Home Affairs acknowledges that most are at risk, and we should take this number with a bit of caution from the ways that they classify, but we see ongoing concerns and around suicide and so forth, again, recently as a few days ago. Shifting very quickly then, for those of you who are unaware or haven't seen, I'm sure most of you are, but and recognising the significant work of many of the panellists here, and I know many of you are watching, I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome in a sense, as I've only recently returned to Australia and work around Australian detention. Very important work has been going for a long time, and I draw directly from that. But there's many ways of classifying detention in Australia currently between immigration detention centres, immigration transit authorities, transit accommodation, and alternative places of detention, which I'll return to. But these different classifications, but all encapsulate a form of closed detention. Of course, there are other forms as well, which we'll come to mention. And we should note that in the recent budget, over $1 billion has been earmarked for the next 4 years for onshore detention and related compliance, including $55 million for Christmas Island's continued functioning. So these are figures released by Home Affairs, the most recent that I'm aware of. In terms then of alternative places of detention, these have been in use since 2010, at least in Australia, with many former sites now closed, new sites opening regularly, and a notable difficulty in identifying these continually shifting sites. There are many definitions of APODs, but we can draw here from the Joint Select Committee from 2012 on detention, which defined APODs, as you can see here in the quote. But important to note the various places and shifting nature of this form of detention, including hospital accommodation, schools, and particularly hotel rooms and apartments. There are many sites that have now closed, most of which were very remote, some which have reopened. And at the moment, these are the sites that I'm aware of currently operating. These APODs have generally remained unknown or have not received much focus, particularly from community resistance, perhaps the biggest example though being Inverbrackie in former military base in South Australia. In late 2019, however, this began to shift with the new APODs of the Mantra Bell City in Preston, in Melbourne, very central in Melbourne, as well as Kangaroo Point Central Hotel in central Brisbane, used primarily for the detention of Medivac transferees who are still awaiting actual medical care. And I frame these spaces as a form of carceral urbanism, recognising that carceral spaces cannot be seen as solely located within prisons, but as part of a continuum between the prison and other social and geographical spaces. There are now significant numbers in these current APODs, much higher, incredibly distinct from previous use of APODs. So this gives us concern and reflection about the shifting nature of Australian detention. And while the federal government announced in 2019 that 19 immigration detention facilities have been closed or put into contingency, but of course there's concern that they reopen, since 2013, other sites and forms of detention have hardened and proliferated, such as the hotels, but nearby in Broadmeadows in Melbourne, MITA and its high security wing as an example. This recent implementation of APODs in Melbourne and Brisbane hotels and following the repeal of Medivac demonstrate the continually shifting and polymorphic nature of onshore immigration detention and bordering practices in Australia. Hotels are designated as APODs by Home Affairs as being a form of transit accommodation of short term, but we know that they're anything but that, with many of the men currently detained, they're facing over or approaching a year in detention. There's concern about also the type of space that this is in. It's been noted over many years that these are actually more restrictive than current detention centres themselves. So just briefly, in wrapping up, want to talk about the risks then of an alternatives to detention framework, which has been seen and been used across Australia, particularly if we see this shift to use of hotel rooms which fit under an alternative form, a lesser form of detention, apparently. And as Robin Sampson and Grant Mitchell, formerly of the International Detention Coalition, note, there's a risk at relying or calling for alternatives to detention as tinkering at the edges and allowing the bulk of the detention regime and the logic of border control to actually remain intact. Now, just finally, thinking through very briefly some notions of an abolitionist framework and praxis. It's important that we look to the examples of Mantra and Kangaroo Point Hotel as one way of challenging these systems. And these have been referred to as spaces of torture by those currently detained. And while non-refugee-led organisations have typically called for alternatives to detention and the typically coupled removal of children from detention, their inability to recognise the continually shifting terrain of the Australian onshore immigration detention landscape and the wider migration industrial complex, or reluctance to call for all persons to be removed from detention and detention itself to be ended and abolished is notable. Meanwhile, refugee-led organisations such as RISE, based in Melbourne, and other refugee solidarity movements employ direct action and abolitionist frameworks, have called for the end of detention in all forms. Groups are becoming more attentive to the government's ability to continually shift immigration detention practices, and recent awareness brought to the use of hotel detention, in large part due to its highly urbanised and central location, has led to further abolitionist calls. As I've noted with Jenna Lloyd and Matt Mitchelson in Beyond Walls and Cages, refugee and migration policies of detention build on racialised colonial geographies and constitute a regime of selective mobility, global apartheid, inhibiting the free movement of the majority of the world's people. And just in summary, to think through then, particularly the work of prison abolitionists such as Ruthie Gilmore, who warn against using reformist reforms as they frame them, this lack of thinking beyond just reform, implementing such as alternatives to detention. And to finally link to the work of Behruz and of Ahmed in their Manus prison theory, in which they note that the prison theory unpacks the many ways that detention centres on Manus and Nauru employ systems of violence but also in onshore detention, community detention, which I didn't get much chance to speak about, and the use of temporary visas, and how these are connected with Australian institutions, companies, and multinational corporations. And we might think of divestment campaigns. This disruption and ending of the detention industry requires a multi-pronged approach, to quote from Ahmed and from Behrouz. And I'll leave it there in thinking about how a multi-pronged approach might look and be enacted. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. Moving on to you, Maria, if that's good.
Hi everyone, thank you to Rachel and Linda for inviting me. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to all the colleagues speaking here today. It's a great honour to be part of this, this group, and especially to Behrouz, and to note his exceptional contribution to our field of study effectively. So the fact that Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded is the most significant fact that's sitting at the heart of my theorisation of Australian law. I've been writing on Australia's violent borders and their role in ensuring colonial rule for the last 15 years. Today I'm speaking to you while in the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. The Kaurna people have never ceded their sovereignty, and I'm incredibly grateful to have lived and had paid academic employment on their land since 2011. So to the traditional peoples of the places in Sydney where the event is being hosted and heard, I'm also grateful. I was born and raised in Sydney, and as a child of migrants, I've been aware also across my lifetime of the racist discourse of gratitude, that migrants should be grateful for the state, for the opportunity, to the state, for the opportunity to have a new and better life. But my gratitude remains to First Peoples, and with First Peoples upon whose lands many poor and dispossessed have been able to build their lives. This is at the same time that Indigenous peoples are further criminalised and impoverished. But as Isabel Coe once said, we have never ceded our sovereignty from one end of the country to the other, and this is always the central point. It was so wonderful to hear Uncle Ray Jackson mentioned previously by Anne in this regard. So Australia's refusal of asylum in at least the last 20 years is inextricably tied up, as we've heard, with the ongoing processes of Indigenous dispossession. And dispossession is achieved in the present day through the work of the nomopoly. This is a term I've coined to make visible the way that Australian law occupies the position of a singular legal authority by effacing its foundationally violent origins and by imposing a framework that seeks to eliminate competition for law. So a nomopoly refers to a monopoly in the creation of a nomos, meaning law in Greek. But in a colonial context, this monopoly of law has the additional feature of structurally foreclosing the operations of first laws of Aboriginal peoples by subjecting all to its rule. So the Australian Constitution is a key exemplar of the colonial nomopoly, as it plays a critical role in the retrospective exculpation for historical and ongoing state violence and economic theft, and in producing legal borders against which targeted populations experience state violence. I can't go into it here, but mere reform, or reformist reform, as we just heard, to a colonial constitution is highly conservative, but this is also part of our discussion. So 20 years after the highly significant, yet I believe under-theorised challenge to colonial law made in Yurima versus Thompson, the complicity and culpability of a genocidal system of law must be reckoned with. This week, we have just learned that Constable Zachary Rolfe has been committed to stand trial for murder in the Northern Territory Supreme Court. The development is being hailed as a landmark. So unique is the fact that a police officer will stand trial for murder over an Indigenous death in custody in the Northern Territory. We have heard that the Victorian government has cut down a culturally significant tree to Djab Wurrung women to make way for a highway. And with protest movements around the world, Black Lives Matter in the US and elsewhere, and SARS in Nigeria, bringing into sharp relief the global prevalence of police brutality stemming from colonial ordering, it is timely for the Australian citizenry to take stock of at least one alarming statistic about its legal system, and one that speaks to the question of genocide, or what I'm calling nomicide. If over 430 Aboriginal people have died in custody since 1991 and no one has ever been convicted, where can Indigenous people turn for justice? When and how will the entrenched colonial monopoly be stripped of its legitimacy and held to account for the carceral and environmental crimes of colonialism? In 1998, Isabel Coe, along with her husband and others, brought an action to the Supreme Court to have the crime of genocide, the Supreme Court of the Australian Capital Territory, to have the crime of genocide recognised in Australian law. When their action was unsuccessful, they sought leave to appeal to the High Court. That court did not consider the undeclared war against Indigenous peoples or their resulting and ongoing deaths at the hands of the state as being substantive, since these issues fell outside the legalistic framing of genocide. I'll read a little bit from the transcript. So Isabel Coe, now you know, it just seems that this is just another form of genocide, that this is happening right now against our people, and the legal system is part of that genocide against our people. Now, if we can't get justice here, where do we go? We are desperate. Our people are dying everywhere. Just today, there is a funeral. You know, we had to make a choice whether to come here or go to a funeral. Now, there has been at least 3 this week. Justice Kirby, what is the substantive thing you want to say to the court? Isabel Coe, well, we want to say that, you know, this war against our people has to end. It has been undeclared for 212 years. Kirby, well, this is a court of law. We're obliged to conform to the law, and there are some very complicated legal questions which are before the court. Now, is there anything else you want to say relevant to those issues? We cannot fix up every issue in the country. We can only deal with the matters that are before the court. Isabel Coe, well, I appreciate that, but someone has to help us stop the genocide in this country against Indigenous people, against Aboriginal people. If we can't get justice here in the highest court of this country, then I think that this court is a party to that genocide as well. This dialogue demonstrates the power of a colonial court to decide on, while simultaneously deciding and dismissing the relevance of issues that have the potential to unravel its own credibility and to allow to open up opportunities for rethinking how the Australian border is managed. So Coe, as we heard, was very clear in her direct and in her assertions. If Indigenous people can't find justice in the highest court of the land for ongoing deaths of Indigenous people under colonial rule, then the court must be part of that genocide. The High Court's inability and unwillingness to hear that sort of thing, we won't hear that sort of thing, is what another judge said, reveals a present absence sitting at the heart of Australian law that must be named and seen. When Australia's sovereign debt to Indigenous people is disavowed, disowned through consent frameworks of colonial laws like the Campaign for Constitutional Recognition, for example, the death and suffering produced by law are obfuscated. In 2007, as the world was gripped by the global financial crisis, Indigenous historian and award-winning fiction writer Tony Birch offered a sobering and urgent challenge to Australia to take responsibility for colonial crimes and sovereign debts. This was the same year that austerity was unleashed legislatively upon remote Indigenous communities using the Northern Territory Emergency Response Act, while silence systematically persisted on the foundational question of sovereign debt. Birch warned that before sovereignty, quote, before sovereignty can become a viable concept for discussion among the wider non-Indigenous community, it needs to redeem and take responsibility for its colonial debts. A legal system lacking consent at its foundation and characterised in the present day by refusal to examine and engage with its violent origin is nomicidal. I've coined nomicide here to capture the killing function of all the arms of colonial law in Australia. Despite the highly visual and systematic episodes of state violence around the world and in Australia, nomophilia, the unflinching belief in law as the avenue to redress social problems, persists powerfully. But if we can see that, and I think many of us can, that law produces dispossession in all its forms of Indigenous people, of poor people, and of migrants and refugees, why is there still a tendency to look to colonial apparatuses for remedies to state violence? The challenge, I believe, is to see law differently in order to urgently address the colonial violence that stems from it. This sounds quite simple, but really it isn't. In academia and in refugee and asylum studies, we're very aware that Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded, but we mainly direct our work to policymakers of the colonial state. This recenters colonial sovereign authority despite the critiques we are making. We say to ourselves and to each other that we must be strategic, but we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and then we produce work and direct it in a manner that presumes that it was. So if we accept that Indigenous sovereignty was never ceded, we must stop addressing our work to illegitimate bodies and authorities, which is why it was so inspirational to hear about the new projects that Behrouz and Omid have underway. Indigenous people should be the most important audience for the work of border politics, refugee and asylum scholars who are developing knowledge relating to permanent access to Indigenous lands and waters. When we call for reforms to asylum laws because they violate refugee lives, we must do so alongside demanding a complete overhaul of the colonial monopoly. Yes, we must shut the camps and refugees around the world must have freedom, but this must come at the same time as our equally loud call for prison abolition, self-determination and sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. This is a harder position for us to take, of course. It's riskier because it asks us to examine our knowledge-making privileges in the white academy and to become mindful of how it might be a recentering of white possession. I'll explain this and end by invoking Eileen Morton Robinson, whose work has already been mentioned by Anne. Her work on patriarchal white sovereignty and white possession is, to my mind, the most significant precursor for Behrouz's notion of kyriarchal power and interlocking systems of oppression. She asserts that not all citizens benefit from or exercise patriarchal white sovereignty equally. Race, class, gender, sexuality, and ableness are markers that circumscribe the performance of patriarchal white sovereignty by citizens within Australian society. She shows across the body of her work that it is not a lack of knowing or understanding about the excesses of state violence on the part of the general population that lead to refugee torture, imprisonment, and Indigenous deaths at the hand of the state. It is their or our possessive investment in the nation as a white possession. This happens socio-discursively, where subjects are disciplined to differing degrees and made to invest in the nation as a white possession. Citizens, she says, are contracted into and imbued with a sense of belonging and ownership. It is a sense of belonging derived from ownership understood within the logic of capital, and in its self-legitimation, it mobilises the legend of Cook's discovery of an unpossessed land. So to conclude, the Australian legal system operates as an homopoly. That is, it usurps all Indigenous laws to impose itself without consent as a singular authority. The absence of consent at the heart of Australian law means that it is a killing, nomicidal law. If the centrality of the homopoly is not challenged for its colonising function, then death by and through law will persist. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. That's great. We might just keep moving along. Claire, if you're up, and then Julie will be last off for the speakers. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, thanks everyone. I just want to thank Linda and Rachel for organising such a fantastic event, for Omid and Behrouz's really important contributions, and for the wonderful keynote by Alison and other speakers who've really made important contributions today. So I want to start by gesturing sort of my interest in looking at this idea of the counted and the uncounted. And I want to explore the kind of effects and processes of being the uncounted by examining the failure to account in Australia those who've been arriving as illegal, inverted commas, maritime arrivals, those who are detained in hotel detention, and we don't have a clear indication of those numbers in government statistics, those who continue to be detained as part of the offshore processing regime, and both the lives and the deaths of those that are not counted. And this practice of uncounting refugees and their lives and deaths has a longer lineage in Australia, which really began with the failure to count or to recognise Aboriginal people as political subjects, and was also really disturbingly marked recently by the failure of the aged care minister in Australia to know and therefore to recognise the number of people in aged care who had died as a result of COVID. So this comprises, I think, a politics of erasure, of suffering and deaths at the border, which renders certain bodies as invisible even while they remain subject to government control. And here, in some of the connections I want to draw between refugees and Indigenous suffering, I draw attention to the work of Joseph Pugliese, Maria Giannakopoulos and Sivendri Pereira, whose work has long pushed for an understanding of these intersections. So my concern here is with thinking through these processes and effects of erasure, both of lives and of deaths. And it was really generated by the kind of evident developments in Australian history, recent Australian history in terms of policies and laws, statements and practices, which began with the difficulty in accessing detailed and accurate information about the numbers of people coming here by boat. And this has been really accompanied by the secrecy provisions in the 2015 Border Force Act. So although the government has loudly proclaimed that it stopped the boats, such declarations do not make it so. As Savitri Taylor has elsewhere suggested, we simply do not know how many boats with asylum seekers attempt to make this journey, the number of boats turned back, and the numbers of any of those who might have died at sea. And although the government continues to provide some statistics on people in detention, it is not evident, for example, how many of these are in hotel detention, and there's no indication of reporting of asylum seekers, the numbers of those who are effectively detained in Nauru and PNG. So these patterns of failures to count, and by this I also mean a failure to value some lives, was also a feature of the Australian Constitution, as we know, where First Nations people were not recognised as political subjects. So in this lacuna of government attention to who counts, sites like Deathscapes and Border Crossing Observatory and many other civil society organisations in Europe are dedicated to mapping and documenting deaths at the border. We've seen this in the Border Crossing Observatory, which has carefully documented these deaths, including deaths at sea and immigration detention. And as the site notes, it's often difficult also to discern from reports whether fatalities at sea occurred within or beyond Australia's border surveillance zone. And moreover, we don't have detailed specificity about the nationality, the gender, the age of people who have died at sea. And as they go on to note, even more importantly, deaths in countries of transit amongst those whose onward travel has been prevented by Australian border control remains completely invisible. We see similar challenges in Northern Africa with movement across from Northern Africa, Syria and Sudan and into Europe and also across the US-Mexican border. The documentation of deaths at sea, Charles Heller and Antoine Picou has noted, is something that is neglected by governments or refused acknowledgement by governments, in which this work of counting the dead who die as an effect of exclusionary border regimes is neglected by government, taken up by civil society groups, and this refusal to count by government agencies is also a refusal to acknowledge, and I quote, the dark side of their migration politics. Governments never recognise their responsibility in migrant deaths and systematically blame smugglers and traffickers, end quote. So without these statistics and what we might see as the counting of lives and deaths, reality of these border control measures remains invisible effectively, not because these bodies don't exist, because they are not documented. Here, migrant deaths are kind of hidden in ways in which the lack of data about those lives and deaths both reflects and reinforces their invisibility. In their 2011 book, Deaths at the Global Frontier, Leanne Weber and Pickering note in their introduction that for every dead body washed up on the shores of the developed world, experts estimate there are at least 2 others that are never recovered. In many ways, there's extensive material gathered, but in others, the material is remarkably absent. And with many counts of border deaths disputed, often there is no count simply at all. So it's also difficult to have a clear sense when we look at the Australian case of where people are located, as I mentioned earlier. Both lives and deaths disappear from view in these kind of statistical representations in their specificity. And yet, oddly, asylum seekers who are detained are also ironically counted with alarming precision as numbers. And this is something that Bruce has talked quite a bit about in his book, No Friend But About the Mountain. And yet asylum seekers are also ironically counted, I've just repeated myself, ironically counted with alarming precision as numbers. That is counted only as a number. At the time of Hamid Kazahai's death, for example, he was referred to as GDD 059, with his impending death simply referred to in government documents as the GDD 059 issue. Yet importantly, the location of death is also critical. In 2 prominent examples of deaths at sea, one on the Turkish coast and one off the rocky shores of Christmas Island, we can see how the disappearance of death right at the border, or the appearance of death right at the border, in the space where sea hits the land of the nation, can prompt these deaths to appear as a tragedy, even if only momentarily. So when infant Alan Kurdi's body was found washed up on the Turkish coastline, and similarly when 50 asylum seekers died on the rocks and sea off Christmas Island, there was a somewhat faint but nonetheless an outpouring of grief by a number of Western communities. Ironically, this didn't lead to greater acknowledgement of responsibility by Western states, but by the focus on people smugglers, in the Australian case, resorting to even more punitive measures. In response to these deaths, the website Deathscapes does not seek to so much to map deaths numerically, but provides a site for the memorialisation of those deaths in their specificity, produced as an effect of the violence of settler colonial states. It is an affirmation of individual lives as grievable, as lives worth counting. So in resisting erasure, Deathscapes work, and I quote, to instantiate agency in contexts in which it is so brutally denied. For Shoshana Fine, the externalisation of the European externalisation policy in relation to refugees acts to distance people seeking asylum from our cognitive and emotional map. Through governing migration and borders at greater distances from European territories, it removes responsibility by European and other states for those deaths. Importantly, the grievability that Deathscapes tries to focus attention on is often only possible in the moment of knowing that a death has occurred, and through acknowledgement of a life as a life worth grieving. For those who attempt to cross borders and who die in the act, the moment of mourning is prevented by this unknowability of death, by the failure to document deaths. But this, of course, does not mean that it does not occur. These bodies are the disappeared, but their disappearance, as Vallely has noted, does not come into view. As Neil Vallely has remarked in his work on disappearance, this is the central logic of the necropolitical era in which we find ourselves. We're putting unknown others to death, making them disappear, reinforces the desired attributes of national sovereignty and invulnerability. Importantly, disappearance here does not simply mean the killing of unknown others. It also includes those others who do not appear in my life, but whose existence enables me to live the life that I do, end quote. That is, those whose life I do not experience as a co-presence are the living disappeared. This is the erasure of the face of the other to whom I have an ethical obligation in Levinasian terms. The deaths of those at sea which appear in view, as in the case of Alan Kurdi and the shipwrecked deaths at Christmas Island. Taking up Butler's observation in her work, Precarious Life, contemporary externalisation policies raise questions about, and I quote, whose lives are regarded as lives worth saving and defending and whose are not. An ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it has never lived. That is, it has never counted as a life at all. Accordingly, in thinking through the question of counting as the management of populations, this failure to count of both lives and deaths is also a measure of whose life is worth counting or deemed to be worth counting. The consequences of this are profound, since the erasure is not just a political gap in the auditing of populations, but is an erasure which is both historical and often embodied. And I go back here to the way that many Indigenous peoples have similarly been erased, not just through outright physical violence, through murder, but in their disappearance through paper. And for refugees through the secrecy of systems which both hide the effects of policy and the numbers and specificities of those impacted by it. To finish with a short example and returning to these connections in relation to the counting of populations, Indigenous populations and those at the border. For Indigenous peoples, the Taino in the Caribbean, this has been an act of what they call paper genocide. For Taino elder Chief Yorga Barakute Estevez, for example, the failure to include the category of the Taino in the census process by colonists in the 19th century was described by him as a paper genocide. Yet in an art-based project, the Taino are, however, writing themselves back into history. For Taino Juliet Diaz Benawanaru, it's who we always knew we were. Being Taino was never a secret to our family in Cuba. All along, we've been writing ourselves back into history. The writing into history of the stories of refugees done by the important work of people, by Barus here, and also Janet Galbraith in her work on writing through fences, is also a political act, one in which those who have sought refuge utilise as a mode of resistance to their erasure in all its manifestations. A statement that we do exist, we are here, and our lives demand recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, that's appreciated. And we might just jump straight through to you, Julie. As people might have noticed, we're running a little bit behind time, but hopefully everyone can stick around to get to the end of this. But over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Rachel. And thank you to this extraordinary panel. I feel like the UWS mascot at the moment, but I'm speaking to you from Gadigal land. It's the land of the Eora Nation. It's land that was never ceded. It's stolen land. And I want to pay my respects to leaders past, present and emerging. And I wait to be really welcomed to country via the creation of treaty. In order to get to what I believe could be the disavowed and certainly the undocumented cost of Australia's refugee policy on Australians, I'm going to make three assumptions that shouldn't ever be made, but should be discussed at great length, but won't be today. The first is that torture is and has been taking place in Australia's detention regime since 2000, both on and offshore, and that there's a growing body of evidence to support that claim. Secondly, that the majority of the Australian electorate know about this, even as we don't know about this at the same time. The majority of the electorate support extremely harsh treatment of those who come by boat seeking Australia's protection. And that's why, with the exception of the last federal election, the tough on refugee messaging has dominated every federal election campaign since 1999 because it works. The final assumption I'm making is that this cruel and inhumane treatment it's operationalised through a series of tactics or strategies, like the deployment of formal and informal channels of propaganda, the privatisation of the detention system that removes transparency and state accountability, the endless state of exception that has almost completely shut down access to the courts by asylum seekers, and the ongoing transformation of the Department of Immigration into the quasi-military super department of Home Affairs. These elements work together to create an ecology that make torture possible in black sites run by private corporations, hosted by impoverished and dependent neighbours. They go a long way to explaining the how of torture, but they don't, for me, explain the why. To answer why Australia condones state-sanctioned torture and why the electorate continues to support or at least tolerate it, I think we need to look to the psychoanalytic, because I think the knowing not knowing bit tells us that a lot of this is unconscious. The frame I used to do this is Sigmund Freud's 1917 paper, Mourning and Melancholia. And I'm going to suggest that between 1972 and 1996, much of Australia was engaged in the very vital nation-building work of mourning the death of the foundational belief in the good and kindly settler of the wide, empty land. In laying this myth to rest, white Australia was finally coming to grief, rightly, over the violent, annihilating colonisation of this land. But this work came to a halt in 1996, when John Howard invited Australians to have a more comfortable and relaxed life, a more comfortable and relaxed state that could only be achieved by not looking back and by renouncing the truth of what he termed a black armband version of history. As Judith Butler has put it, where there is no public recognition or discourse through which such losses might be named and mourned, melancholia takes on cultural dimensions. I think much of Australia has been stuck in a melancholic, psychoaffective terrain for the last 25 years, and that it is melancholia that powers and energises the strategies and tactics that create the ecology that make the cruel and inhumane treatment of children, women and men not just possible, but also likely. I can't, in the 10 minutes I've got, I can't detail the elements that Freud ascribed to mourning, except to say that he saw mourning as healthy, despite its sometimes incoherence, its sometimes withdrawal from the world, and its sometimes brief periods of psychosis. But the elements of melancholia, I suspect, animate the tactics that enable the torture, are also the same elements that have left Australia a more lifeless, shallow politic, a nation unable to count or account for the dead amongst us, a nation unable to imagine how to deal with the threat of climate change, of species extinction, a nation where the most powerful demand victim status, even as they're bullying and hectoring thousands of people, some to the point of suicide. The denial of death at the heart of melancholia means the melancholic nation, in denying the need to mourn, must bury the body very deeply. The consequence of this is that we must also bury reality with it, and with that, much of our own vitality and lifefulness. This is one of the really extraordinary points first noted by Freud in the paper, when he observed the shallow half-aliveness of the melancholic. In denying the violence of this nation's colonisation, the need for a black armband understanding of history, it becomes possible and increasingly necessary to deny other deaths in all sorts of ways. And we've just heard some of them. I'm reminded also of Prime Minister Tony Abbott saying in 2015 that he was sick of being lectured to by the UN when the UN had found that aspects of Australia's border protection policy had breached the International Convention Against Torture. Rather than react with appalled apologies and commitments to act, Mr. Abbott said, "I really think Australians are sick of being lectured to by the United Nations." The problem is this denial can't be contained. As we deny the deaths offshore, the abuse and inhumane treatment, we begin to deny other deaths and other realities. Realities like the need to deal with climate change. The disavowal of reality was on display this time last year when 25 fire chiefs asked again to meet with the Prime Minister to prepare for what would be a disastrous summer. The Prime Minister refused. He refused again when he was holidaying in Hawaii and asked to come home, and he explained that despite the fact that the east coast of Australia was engulfed in flames, he promised kids a holiday. and then added insult to injury rather, by saying, besides which I can't hold a hose, mate. The same day he said that, 2 young firefighters were burned to death. The denial of reality on display that day was shocking. Freud argued the melancholic, in a sense, fell out of real time. The melancholic is stuck in a loop of almost compulsive repetition, a state described as the inhibition of vital becoming. There's been a lot of inhibition of vital becoming over the last 25 years. For 20 years, Australian politicians have been unable to progress the vital work of becoming climate resilient. And this denial has, there's actually climate denial in the current government itself, but this stuckness has real world impacts, which mean we have no climate goals, we have no energy targets, there are no farming transition plans. It means coal impacted communities are about to be left high and dry without any kind of industrial restructuring packaging included in their lives. It means that last summer, millions of hectares were burnt, billions of animals incinerated, and over 34 people died. In the midst of a global pandemic, this denial of death is played out nightly as Prime Minister Morrison and his supporters demand the economic recovery come right now. There's no longer a word given to the over 700 families who are still grieving the death of their loved ones, particularly their elders. In Australia right now, in the depths of a global pandemic, it is as if death is something we no longer do. Finally, while mourning is enabled by the symbolic, the psychological working through of grief and of loss, a characteristic of the melancholic is that they are unable to deal with the symbolic or metaphoric at all. For the melancholic, everything must be practical and pragmatic. I'm reminded of John Howard's contempt for what he called the symbolic act of saying sorry, his contempt of the symbolic act of signing up for action on climate change. The symbolic and the metaphoric are rejected because empathy and a lack of control lurk within those worlds. So every leader since Howard has valorised the practical while disdaining the symbolic. But the lifefulness and love itself, if you like, lives within the symbolic. It is the sphere that nurtures and creates subjectivity in its fullest sense. So to deny it is to devitalise life itself. As a consequence, we as a nation don't know the second verse of our national anthem. We don't know what date to have as Australia Day. We don't know what kind of flag we'd like. We have no binding and building story that includes all of us. We remain a nation largely undone. Before finishing, I want to really briefly touch on the narcissism, which is at the heart of melancholia. A belligerent narcissism that insists on being the victim to the other, bullying, however delusional that might be. And you see that all the time. You know, Minister Dutton, Prime Minister Morrison, when they will be talking about a 17-year-old girl on Nauru who's been battered and bruised and framing her up as someone who's trying to manipulate the good heart of Australia. Peter Dutton is particularly skilled at turning the most powerless people on the planet into somehow extremely powerful and invariably manipulative. We saw it recently in 2019, a tragic example of this, when the Australian Senate was on the verge of passing the motion that it's okay to be white, as if that was ever in doubt in Australia. Lacan in 1988 linked this kind of narcissism to a false sense of autonomy. He said, recognising his own image in the mirror, like Narcissus, the infant assumes the illusion of autonomy, imposing an imaginary unity and a self-sufficiency upon his own irredeemable internal divisions and fractures. It is this element of the melancholic that is anti-relational and built on a fantasy of an independence that doesn't exist in reality. And just in concluding, I'll just say that, you know, we really need to ask ourselves if, you know, did we really think that as a nation we could subject thousands of people to the madness-making, soul-destroying, indefinite, arbitrary detention for years and years and not suffer any consequences ourselves? Did we really think we would get away with murder? One thing we know about each other today that we didn't know 20 years ago, and that is that when given the choice between better interest rates, tax cuts, a relaxed and comfortable life, or ending this brutal regime that is torturing innocent women, men, and children, we will vote for tax cuts, interest rates, and a relaxed and comfortable life every time. And that fact alone undoes us as a nation.
Thanks, Julie. That wraps up our speaker session. I'm going to throw now to Claudia Tesrito, who's going to manage and facilitate the panel discussion that we're going to move into now. Thanks, Claudia.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everyone. So I'm Claudia Tesrata, and I'm chairing, facilitating the panel discussion, which we're moving to now. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Darlinghurst in Sydney, and that this land was never ceded. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, past, present and emerging. Big thank you to Rachel and Linda for organising today's symposium and gathering such a stellar interdisciplinary group of speakers that we've just heard from. And we're now going to turn to three fantastic panellists who I'll introduce shortly. They will each respond to a few aspects of the talks that you've just heard and tell us a little about their own perspectives as well. Each of the three panellists will pose one or some two key questions, either for the speakers, but also for us all generally to consider and to think through post the symposium. And we then return to the seven speakers, the seven paper givers, with very short responses. They will have 3 minutes each to raise their own question or to respond to anything raised by the panellists. And we then will have a little bit of time also for questions from you, from the audience. Let me just very briefly offer a few reflections in listening to the talks this morning. I'm struck by questions of counting, of what counts, and also of who counts, and the related questions of accountability and of visibility. I'm also struck by the importance, the real importance, I think, of the interdisciplinary perspectives that we've heard this morning on the topic of politicising asylum. But also the links between concepts and ideas, so sometimes very, theoretical work, and lived experience, that those things need to inform policy, but also informing the public's understanding of what is going on and of the violent practices and erasures that are performed in their name. I want to follow up on Behrouz's very important comments on universities. We do need to call out research institutions that many of us are employed in and by, that historically are also part of the theft of ideas, of cultures, and they continue in many cases to work in ways that silence certain voices. How can we collectively support people with lived experience of the asylum systems, and indeed all those forms of state violence that we've heard about this morning, to be more visible as knowledge producers, not merely, as often happens, as informants for research projects. I also want to echo Alison's comments in talking about the importance of Manus prison theory and the explanations by Behrouz and Ahmed of Manus prison theory as challenging Australians to think deeply about their role in legitimating the politicisation of asylum that we've heard so much about this morning over now 3 decades. that inaction is also action and allows the dehumanizing, the torture, the disappearance, and the trickery of counting that we've heard about. So the panelists that we'll hear from now, let me introduce them. Philomena Murray is Honorary Professorial Fellow in the School of Social and Political Science at Melbourne University. She is the Personal Jean Monnet Chair awarded by the EU and is the Director of the Comparative Network on Refugee Externalisation Policies that links European scholars. And Philomena is also the co-founder and joint convener of Academics for Refugees. Anthea Vogel is Senior Lecturer at UTS, Faculty of Law. Her research addresses refugee law and regulation of migration and borders, focusing on the relationships between law and narrative, and the use of executive power in the exclusion of refugees and non-citizens. She's a national convener of Academics for Refugees, and her forthcoming book, Judging Refugees, addresses refugee oral testimony in status determination processes. Linda Briskman holds the Margaret Whitlam Chair of Social Work at Western Sydney University. Areas of research and activism include asylum seeker rights, Indigenous rights and challenging racism, most recently also Islamophobia. She publishes widely in each of those areas. Her most recent book is the co-edited Indigenous Health Ethics and Appeal to Human Rights. Philo, you have the mic for about 7 minutes.
Thank you, Claudia. Greetings everyone here in Australia and many parts of the world, because I know we have a fantastic audience and set of participants around the world. I greet you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Thank you to all the speakers. I feel so energized by the commitment of the speakers and also just even simply looking at the chats today, because one of my questions is about how we bring about policy change. What should we be asking? How can we as academics, for instance, who act as with advocates, who act as advocates and to engage actively with people of refugee experience, how can we develop a stronger research policy nexus? And that is my first question, not only for the panel, but it is for all of us. But I also would like to reflect on the fact that the horrific experiences we have heard about, the horrific policies of successive Australian governments have also got some parallels with Alison's absolutely fantastic keynote speech. And that reminds us that our comparative work, our transnational work has to show that, first of all, Australia is not a model for any policy towards refugees. But secondly, that rather than Australia being an outlier, there are many other countries in the world, particularly in the global north, who are doing similar similar deleterious policies and actions. And so I think it's important for us to recognise that Australia not only should not be a model, as we've already recognised in this panel and elsewhere, but also there are other parts of the world that are engaged in parallel types of activities as well. And Margarita Matera and Tamara Tabakovic and I are working on a paper on that. The title today is The Politicisation of Asylum and the Politics of Asylum. We've heard of the experience of asylum from refugee voices. We've also heard about the ownership of the land, ownership of sovereignty, ownership of bodies. And we know that the externalisation policies, the epitome of politicisation, are particularly looked at from a securitisation lens. Alison, in her previous work as well, has talked about maritime interception and remote detention and how they function as in a sense as a performative act of hiding and distancing. And this geographical distance that she has often talked about is linked with what many of you have talked about, the not counting, the invisibility in public discourse, the utilisation of corrosive narratives that we see. And so we have this governance by distancing. And we're aware from Anne's written paper that she refers to the entire Australian mainland being excised, the thousands of people that have been detained offshore, and that cruel to be kind measure that of saving lives, which we know is particularly corrosive. So the issue of research-informed advocacy in research to this research policy nexus is particularly important. And Andrew raises some questions, some of them uncomfortable questions for many, but I think important questions, and thank you, Andrew, for that, about the continued use of detention of APODs and others. But he also talks about how people are sometimes not calling for removal of detention and abolition of detention, but rather he talks about the risk of tinkering around the edges. And I think this is an important issue that we need to go back to, because many are calling for a lot more than that, but our voices are obviously not being heard enough against these corrosive narratives. Many of the papers talked about the colonial actor and not counting of deaths, and I think this is particularly important. There are themes that are coming through here that, even having read the draft papers, are much stronger than perhaps we might have imagined. So we have this divesting of responsibility by governance and governments in the politicisation of asylum. This is combined, as we know, with the denial of humanitarian principles by governments and by the European Union, for example. We see that the narrative of risk is where refugees and asylum seekers, people seeking protection, are indeed then regarded as the risk. And they are engaged in that precarity that some of you have talked about. They have this persistent insecurity, never knowing when they'll be relocated, and even don't have the privacy of a toilet, as we've been reminded by Bahuz. So the politicisation of externalisation means that politicians can now say what in the past would never have been acceptable, where there is an offshoring of responsibility by reluctant host states of the global north. The denial of access, which we see with Australia probably winning the dubious award of massive cruelty towards asylum seekers and refugees. But I really want to emphasize that this is something that many of us really want to continue to engage on in a transnational, a comparative and an international space, because we are trying to engage with this. And I'd also like to point out that many advocates and academics put themselves sometimes at personal risk. I know it's not what people seeking asylum go through, but there are threats. There is an undermining of people, and particularly of female advocates who are academics or non-academics in some cases, and there is a narrative of threat, and much more than just simply a narrative in some cases. And I want to salute those people who are dealing with that as well. So there is a risk there as well, because we have these corrosive narratives. We have externalization that's not just happening with offshoring to third countries, to non-EU countries, non-Australian countries, to Libya, to Turkey, to Papua New Guinea, etc. But we also have an internal externalization, if you can call it that, and that is the utilization of detention within Australia and other countries, with the denial of welfare, with the denial of health support, as many of us have heard about. And Andrew, thank you for raising that to us in such an important way as well. A denial of welfare support and of humanity. And so as we move forward in our understanding of this and this responsibility divesting, we are also seeing a type of distancing. It's the politics of distancing. Marino, Lax and Pedersen talk about it in terms of the spatial, relational and functional and instrumental levels. But I would actually add a values distancing, because our states are divesting themselves of knowledge, of values and humanitarianism, but they are also divesting themselves of knowledge, access to that knowledge. The unwillingness of governments to even discuss this in some cases with us, those of us who try to actually bring about a sensible conversation, as some of us have experienced. So there is this.
Can I ask you to wrap up?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. My second question was about how can we draw on the international international comparative work as academics and also as advocates and people with refugee experiences. My final comment is, when are we going to, question is, when are we going to start saying to politicians, I'll vote for you primarily? on your refugee policies. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philo. I'll turn straight to Anthea for the second panelist response. Anthea, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Claudia, and thanks so much, Philo. And of course to the presenters for their excellent papers, and especially to Omid and Behrouz for facilitating us coming together to engage in managed prison theory. Before I begin, I also wanted to acknowledge that I am living, working and presenting today on Gadigal land, and that sovereignty was never ceded. So it's been such an energising morning, as so many people have said. I think it's the first event in a while that's actually made me miss an in-person conference, so that's exciting. I wanted to start by saying, though, that it's no surprise that given managed prison theory is one of the concepts drawing today's events together, that a recurring theme in the papers is the centrality of colonialism and ongoing present-day settler violence as a framework for understanding, but also resisting Australia's approach to refugees and non-citizens more broadly. It feels to me both timely and urgent that these connections feature centrally in a discussion of what is often carved out as standalone refugee policy amongst the intersecting forms of racist violence enacted as part of Australia's border regime, both on Australian territory and on so-called and offensively named offshore sites of Australian torture and incarceration. The fact that we still call these other nation states offshore, I think represents a lot about the ways in which the kind of colonial logic has infiltrated Australia's border policy and is always part of it. I also think it's hugely important and hopeful, as Omid said, that Behrouz and Omid describe managed prison theory not just as a theory, but as a shared philosophical activity. And I guess revisiting some of their words that Alison was also drawn to, the idea that managed prison theory is a creative and political project that involves ongoing research and organising, undertaken both by Behrouz and Omid, and the networks of scholarship and collective action that the theory has given rise to. I think this is so crucial to the way in which we think about how we engage with the theory, both as academics and as activists. And as such, drawing on colonial history and settler violence as a framework not only has explanatory power in this context, but I think should allow us to identify and investigate sites of solidarity, collaboration and action. The centrality of colonial history and the colonial present is laid out very clearly in the idea of kyriarchy itself, explained by Behrouz and Omid in their joint work, but also in Anne's and Maria's papers this morning. And Maria's paper directly connected kyriarchy and kyriarchal systems with the foundational work of Eileen Morton Robinson, which whose work Anne also drawed upon. And in particular, Eileen Morton Robinson's theorising of sovereignty as a tool of white possession. Morton Robinson's foundational work on white patriarchal sovereignty shows that extreme active state violence, including the ones we are talking about today, so racialised exclusions at the border, are inherent to ongoing white possession, and that this violence is continuously connected to preserving what Maria calls the colonial nomopoly. And by nomopoly, Maria explained that she means both the original and ongoing acts, and particularly legal processes of Indigenous dispossession that are taking place all around us. The point that border violence is rooted in a specific Australian coloniality is also central to managed prison theory. It follows then that these connections have to reject the legal fiction, so it's a narrative fiction of Australian sovereignty and its legitimacy, and address the effects of Australia's offshore policy, in particular on local populations, as absolutely central to this analysis rather than sidelined and ignored. Such a framing, for example, brings into view and involves Behrouz's ongoing work documenting the effects of managed prison on Manusians, and his work, which was part of the Deathscapes launch, I think last year now, talking about the fact that local Manusian officials, the Manusian governor and Manusian people reported having never been spoken to, let alone consulted with, when Australia established managed prison to enact its own border regime and its exclusions. So as part of all of these intersections, in thinking about a couple of questions, I wanted to come back to Maria's, I think, really important point, and I'm quoting from her paper, that is no longer sufficient to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and then proceed as though it was. As managed prison theory similarly makes us consider how we resist and think about the logic of the colonial state in campaigns for justice for non-citizens, and managed prison theory as an explicit call to action, I wanted to ask what this can and already does look like and mean for our collaborations, scholarship and activism. So connect, I guess, to Alison's question of what next. I think this includes and is connected to, but not limited to, the Black Lives Matter movement in Australia and the current and urgent campaigns against deaths in custody here. How does this focus shape and reshape campaigns both for Indigenous sovereignty and against detention and border industries? Behrooz has already mentioned a number of his and Omid's really exciting upcoming projects on this exact question, and I think it would be great to talk about this further. As well, I think Anne's paper provided a really powerful example of this in exploring how the Indigenous passport ceremony challenges the specific ways of knowing that are associated with proprietary sovereignty and the binary of guest-host relationships that comes to infuse how we talk about refugees. As I ask the question, I'm also thinking of the incredible example of the Deathscapes project, which Maria and others have been involved in and also spoken powerfully about, but it would be great to return to some of these. That's it.
Thanks very much, Anthea. Linda, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri land, a land that was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. I really want to thank everybody, every speaker, every panellist, and also the wider audience who also posed some really compelling questions today. And all of the speakers, I think, have used Manus Island theory, adapted Manus Island theory to pose some new frameworks, new ideas. And I thank you, Omid and Behrooz, for extending all our thinking. And I think your work will continue to do that for a long time to come. I've got just one question I want to pose in the interests of brevity and time. And it speaks, I suppose, most directly to Claire's paper and also somewhat to Julie's. And it's just, you know, in terms of alternative framings. And I'm wondering if we can perhaps think about the idea of a death by deterrence as useful for advocacy and for research and moving us into the future. And what I'm referring to here are physical deaths, you know, recognising, particularly from what Alison said, that the idea of death is much more than physical death, but I'm just keeping it simple for now. As we've heard from Claire, you know, deaths go uncounted, they go unrecognised. And of course, sometimes this changes, and it changes for political purposes, as Philo also mentioned and Claire alluded to in one of the questions. I think the question was Lucy around this, and that example that people have also referred to, the terrible boat tragedy on Christmas Island in 2010, when 50 people died when their boat was smashed against the rocks. And of course, these were deaths that were counted because they had to be, because it was so visible across our TV screens. But there was also an invisibility. You know, I went to the coroner's inquest and people became numbers. But those who died and those who survived became numbers. So there was lack of recognition there once again. And then that was the political opportunism that people referred to when government changed its rhetoric, as others have mentioned. You know, there was sort of, I guess I can call it fake compassion. You know, we've got to stop boats to prevent deaths at sea, which was such a, you know, a powerful rhetoric that, you know, many people were convinced that that was what to do. It was really hard to break that down. And of course, the reality was, you know, the various deterrence measures put in place at that time caused a lot more deaths that went uncounted and unrecognised. And trying to link it a little bit to what Julie was saying, when we're talking about torture, and, you know, really applaud that your work on that and others, Behrooz and Omid have very clearly mentioned torture too. So can we talk about, can we conceptualise death by deterrence as a form of torture? can that concept of death by deterrence, be also applied to, what's happened, the terrible deaths on Nauru and Manus Island, and thank you very much, Anthea, for stopping me using the word offshore detention as part of the colonial project. I'll bear that in mind in my future work. So here, where deterrence and denial on Manus and Nauru have resulted in people dying with only transitory publicity, and certainly no movement in political intransigence. It's sort of another form of erasure that Claire has spoken about. So is the idea of death by deterrence useful or not? That's the question I'm posing. That's it.
Thanks very much, Linda. And so I'll turn straight away to the speakers, to the paper givers. And Alison, the microphone is yours as the keynote, and then I will run through each of the papers in order. Alison, you have about 3 minutes.
I actually, I just want to use a minute to say thank you for these incredible papers and to apologize that I'm about to disappear to put my second child to bed. But I'm really inspired and overwhelmed too by the talks and the questions that are coming in. I mean, the only one that jumped out at me that I feel coherent to start to answer, it's 10 o'clock at night here, is about the urgency of contributions that researchers can be making right now. Like someone asks, what are the most effective and urgent contributions? And Philomena, I appreciated your question in this area too, about the links between research and policy. And I'm hesitant to answer that only insofar as I think they're so different in different national contexts, depending politically and historically and institutionally on what is happening. But I think I'm so inspired by the kinds of collaborations that both Omid and Behrooz are writing about, and that are happening in so many places, the collaborations that are intellectual and artistic and political that transcend all the distances and disappearances that everyone's been talking about. And so I think in any form, the research that we do and the speaking that we do and the writing that we do and the art that we make also has this capacity to transcend that distance. And I think work like documentary films and writing that moves beyond our usual kind of outlets as academics is so important. And those aren't novel ideas, but ideas that are nonetheless not always obvious or easy for academics to engage in for exactly the reasons that I think Behrooz mentioned, that we can be, prisoners of a kind of the university and the systems that we're subjected to. So I think the provocation and the importance of those collaborations that break us out are so crucial. So I'm sorry I'm losing my coherence at the late hour, but thank you all.
Thanks very much, Alison, and thank you for staying up for us. So I'm going to turn to and give the microphone to Behrooz and Omid. I'm not sure which of you would like to start, but you have the microphone.
Maybe I'll just say a couple of words and then I'll let Behrooz respond to everyone and leave us with some really insightful, provocative words. Just really briefly, there's just so much that's been discussed today that's going to stay with me for a long time. And I don't really know what to focus on, but I think what has really, I think, inspired me particularly is this idea of the idea of what academics can do differently, and how all of us, just by participating in this space and by imagining and struggling for new ways of knowing and new ways of engaging with different audiences, how we can change the social imaginary, how we can create new refugee imaginaries. And maybe we can start building from what we've started here, and not what we've started here, but what has been going on for a very long time, but what has really been solidified here. Maybe we can start thinking about ways that refugees can act as different, or people with experiences of displacement and exile in general can play different roles and contribute in different ways to academic spaces, and disrupt the kind of bordering that takes place in academic spaces, and think about the academy as also one of the roots or the foundations for the colonial project in general. So think about the university not just a place, not just an institution, but also as an ideology that strengthens and distributes bordering practices in very ruthless, brutal ways, as well as more maybe more subversive or covert ways as well. So I think maybe we can start thinking about ways that refugees can be part of our teaching and our research that can then extend to different kinds of, or new kinds of activism. How can papers be written in this space? How can we be involved in different publication projects? How can grants involve people with lived experience? How can teaching involve people with genuine insights into displacement and exile? So I think this can act as a really powerful method to completely disrupt the social imaginary, and really introduce refugee voices as knowledge producers, and not just as people who have witnessed, or people who have testimony of border violence, but as people who can actually contribute to the transformation of these systems of oppression.
Thank you, Ahmed. Behrooz, the microphone is yours if you want to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should ask this question too, that who is running Australia now? Those politicians who are running the detentions. So I think that should be one of the main questions, because we are talking about the refugees, and we are talking, sometimes some people talk about the indigenous people, I mean, in terms of this policy. And everyone just talk about the refugees, but no one actually think about Australia as a nation, as a society, because this policy is not only damage the refugees, this policy actually has damaged political culture in Australia, has damaged the democracy, has damaged the principles. And I think that should be a matter, that should be a matter. So that is a part of this narrative, that is a part of this discourse. We cannot, when we claim and when we believe that Manus Island and Nauru are a part of Australia, we should acknowledge this, that impact on Australia too. You cannot treat the refugees in this way and treat your people in a right way. So we have many examples now that how this policy damaged Australia as a country. Of course, they spent $9 billion. We are not talking about that. We are not talking about how this system is corrupt, how the companies who are working in the detention, they create this industry, and they are using the money, they are making money. We are not talking about that. We should, I mean, we are not only talk about that. We can look at it in different ways in terms of the principles, how that impact on the principles, how, you know, if I give you an example, I remember in Manus Island, I think if I give you an example is better. In Manus Island, the system used to use cigarettes to punish us, to take control of us. Sometimes they cut the cigarette and they say that you should do this, you should do this. For example, we refuse to give case to them. They cut the cigarette. We refuse to go out to the new camps. They cut the cigarette. And exactly they did that on the environmental activists. Exactly they did that. You know, they cut some support of them, you know. I mean, that is only a very small example. You know, they created a dictatorship system in Manus Island towards the refugees. A secrecy, on base of secrecy. And in other side, in Australia, everyone was shocked when they attacked the ABC office, when they charged some of the journalists. You know, it's very related to each other. I mean, generally what I want to say is that it's very important that we look at that side too. Because if we just talk about the refugees and we say that the refugees are victim under this, and I think that we cannot create change, because people don't care about the refugees. People don't care about refugees. And I think we should look at it in that way too. Because, and now this policy become a model for UK, and I'm sure other countries look at it as an example. So when you torture the refugees, is not only, you are not only torturing the refugees, you are damaging many things, damage the principles. And now we can see that even is not a matter for Australia, now is a global matter.
Thank you, Behrooz. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn to Anne. Anne, the microphone is yours.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm also really energized by this discussion. I think it's been really fantastic. Just quickly, just to turn to the question that Anthea posed, you know, following Maria's really important point. I think we can't just acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and then keep acting as if it was. So who do we address our interventions to, I think is the question. And I guess there are two things that occur to me. One is that for all of the, you know, I really appreciated Julie's talk and trying to understand the public support for torture, you know. But at the same time, for all that support, there's a lot of people who don't support it. And I think that's where we have to start. And I am really inspired by the sort of combination of abolitionist, sanctuary, and Indigenous mobilising in different parts of the world that are all pulling together these intersecting forms of politics, and that are at heart radical democratic forms of politics that don't always address themselves to the state, right? So that new forms of community organising that don't wait for policymakers to make the lead, but that also have dimensions of those movements that address policy making. So I think there are lots of examples we can look to and that are already happening all around us, and take inspiration from them in what can seem like a very despairing field of politics. And the second thing I would say is this point about the university. I think it's really important, and I think this is the question of how, you know, of what it means to decolonize the university. And as we really commit to having those conversations, I guess just a caution that doesn't get reduced to a liberal politics of diversity, of just bringing in underrepresented groups without addressing the systemic forms of epidemic violence that the university is a part of. So I think there's sort of two areas that we can address our energies to that can help.
Thanks very much, Anne. Andrew had to leave because he had teaching at 1. So Maria, I'm turning straight to you. The microphone is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. I've got a few notes here because there's a lot to try and pull together. Thanks to everyone. It was a fantastic discussion to be a part of. Julie, in her paper, raised this point, and maybe I'm decontextualizing it a bit here, but did we think we would get away with murder? And in fact, we have many times, you know, over 430 times. For example, when we're looking at Indigenous deaths in custody in Australia, and just this week, just a few days ago in New South Wales, inquiries looking into, you know, once again, inquiring, trying to find out the facts that are already known. And this is something that that we also heard in Alison's talk about. There's evidence out there, the evidence can't be heard. So it's being directed, you know, in the wrong, in perhaps non-constructive directions. Thank you to Anthea for her points and her question. And I really liked her idea of rejecting legal fictions, and that's something that is a really hugely important task to undertake. It's very difficult, but I think that a way to begin to do that is to take the question of abolition, to take the question of defunding police and prisons, decarceration. This is where colonisation maintains itself against all of the populations that are that concern us, that is refugees, Indigenous people and poor people. This is a really important point as well, that it actually moves beyond racial lines as well, the question of abolition. So that's a way in which, you know, what I talk about, you know, in thinking about the law as being productive of the problem rather than the remedy for it, a way to begin to chip away at that is to take these movements seriously: abolition, no prisons, defunding police. Debbie Kilroy, in her submission to the New South Wales inquiry into deaths in custody for Sisters Inside, said that the main risk for dying in custody is being in custody. So why does the colonial state continue to have its love affair with locking people up? This is the crucial point for us to think about. I also want to say something very quickly about the importance of new language, and this is something that was coming out very strongly in Amid's talk today, but also across the body of Behruz's work. I had a colleague send me a text message to say also how important it is that that many people on this panel today are using their second language and telling their stories, their embodied stories. Amid, you talk about the way that the knowledge that you and Behruz are producing shouldn't just be the experiential, but the experiential actually does need to be the foundation of philosophy, of theory. So I think it's incredibly powerful for that reason. And yeah, look, I think I might leave it there. Otherwise, I'm just repeating myself and getting very excited over all of these ideas. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. Claire, I'm going to turn straight to you. The microphone is yours.
Oh, thanks so much, Claudia. I just had to duck out for a moment. My mother's not well, but she's fine. So, look, something that that struck me in some of the comments were around, and I can't recall who noted this, but talking about the kind of inaction, the way that inaction itself is an action, and also the kind of shifting ways in which deterrence works. So we think about deterrence working in relation to detention, but I'm increasingly concerned, I know other people are looking at this kind of trend, but the way in which people, even if they're released from detention, are subject to conditions that function as kind of a form of punishment anyway. So it's punishment without the walls. Maria and I talked a little bit about this in our work on kind of castle expansion, but what happens is that if we think about the way that people are categorised and counted, then this doesn't count as a form of punishment, doesn't count as detention. And yet these sort of new forms of categorisation of people living in appalling conditions in community still functions as punishment. So I guess just one last word to say on that is that we need to be alert to the ways in which the border changes and transforms itself in new ways, and to keep being vigilant about the forms that those new sort of border control measures take. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I'm aware that time is moving on, but that were the main comments I wanted to make, and thanks everyone for your contribution.
Thanks very much, Claire. And Julie, the microphone is now yours.
Yeah, where to start? I guess what I'm struck, the reason I think psychoanalytic frames are really useful to work with is because I think when we're talking about torture, we are almost off the map of the rational. So we need to find ways of talking about what is not rational. And psychoanalysis gives us really great tools for that. The thing I'd say about melancholia is it's an affective state that will co-opt most things into it. So I'm aware there's been 20 years of resistance on all sorts of levels by all sorts of people that has been smart, strategic, enduring, and ultimately futile. And part of the reason for that is there is a co-option within this psychic frame that I think we need to be powerfully mindful of. Everything can become part of it, except mourning can't become part of it. And the great thing that's come out of this discussion from all sorts of papers is the need for the new. The other thing that Freud talks about in mourning is mourning gives rise to newness. Out of this chaotic swamp of stuff and incoherence, we get newness. We get a huge vitality of life. We get a huge rise in the kind of erotic in the fullest sense of the word, and we get lifefulness. So a nation, however inadequately, a nation engaging with the story of mourning will produce new things, new dance companies, new theatres, new royal commissions, new legislation, new laws, and a kind of newly imagined people. And I'm, despite how absolutely terrible everything looks in 2020, ultimately I'm really hopeful about signs that mourning is making its presence felt again in Australia. Black Lives Matter is a really vital part of this. The statement of the heart, the truth-telling in that is really vital. The challenge before all of us to find new ways, new languages, new words, new ways of studying and being with each other, that the very struggle of that is energizing of mournfulness. And that's, Melanie Klein picked up a lot of Freud's work, and she was the one who taught us about splitting, who taught us about how we, in order to become whole, we ultimately need to look in the eyes of the other, recognize that we have hurt them, and be overwhelmed with shame for that. And I think we are getting to the moment where that's what happened with the Christchurch massacre. For one moment, white Australia recognised in the eyes of those brutalised New Zealanders that we had hurt them. And that's why tough against refugee rhetoric did not feature in the last federal election we had, because there was a moment of shared shame. And we need to find those moments. And I think that's my 3 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Julie. And I'm going to hand the microphone back to Rachel, who's going to manage the general Q&A. Rachel?
Thanks, Claudia, and thank you everyone for the most amazing discussion. I think if anyone's been going through the chat, you realize there's a lot of people who have gotten so much from what you guys have talked about today. So thank you to everyone for that time, expertise and knowledge that we've talked about. I'm also very conscious of being over time. I don't want to leave the Q&A though, so I'm just going to try my best to maybe collate a few of them together so that we can get through. If I could start, Linda, just because you've actually suggested you might want to answer this one live, there is a question from Amy, and I think this goes on the back of some of the discussions we've been having about, you know, the role of academics and researchers, but Amy's in particular is asking what people's opinion are on the extent of NGOs and not-for-profits working with asylum seekers and refugees in Australia. Are they scapegoats for the government to avoid providing more funding? And by giving to charities, are we risk neglecting accountability? And how do we find a happy medium whilst also demanding political action or change on this? Do you want to try and address that first, Linda?
Yeah, I saw that question, and I think there are different ways of responding to it. You know, perhaps the bluntest way, and perhaps it's a bit of a cruel way, is seeing some of those actions as colluding with government exclusion and in government rhetoric and practices. So if the state is abrogating its responsibility and we as a society are picking it up, you know, what does that say about us? And that's one question, and that's at one extreme end. At the other end, I'm interested in the work, and this is coming from my social work perspective, of a writer called Maurice Moreau, who a very long time ago, I can't remember, when he was the founder of what we call structural social work, which looks at systemic disadvantage. But he talked about the need for immediate tension relief while dealing with long-term systemic issues. And I think when we're looking at the role of NGOs and community organisations, and that goes across, you know, a whole lot of spheres, I'm thinking, you know, during somebody's raised the question of the pandemic, you know, what happened, you know, in the lockdown, you know, in the flats in North Melbourne, for example. It's another example that, you know, people do need sustenance. If the government isn't providing it, that it's up to the rest of us perhaps to jump in and do that, but bearing in mind that it's not enough on its own, that we have to be working for long-term change and for the realisation of civil and political rights.
Great, thanks, Linda. I would throw that to maybe more people to answer, but I might just try and work through a few more questions if that's okay, and we can always, if people want to come back in at some point and address some of these earlier ones, please do. There is a question around onshore asylum seekers with refugee status who are onshore, so approximately 30,000, Sally's suggesting, who are kept permanently excluded from education, social support, so, you know, job seeker, job keeper. There's another question with a similar question to it, so I'll put the two of them together, but I guess it's essentially looking at refugees and asylum seekers onshore, and in particular how they've been treated during COVID pandemic in terms of the way they've been excluded or continue to be excluded from those social support mechanisms. And I think that's probably just a general one to anyone on the panel, but how best to address that cohort, I guess, that's onshore during the COVID with removal of a whole bunch of support services from there. I don't know if anyone in particular wants to jump on that one.
If I can just say something, I think what this shows is and Philo and Angeline Bernardine and I have written about the way that the kind of treatment of people who are in hotel detention or immigration detention in Australia during COVID is sort of straightforward case of hypocrisy in terms of the kind of measures that we've seen in relation to the Australian community, the transparency about government, well, some limited transparency in the Australian case, but generally speaking, government's being very clear about the process that they're using, the kind of protective measures that people need to adopt, and the risk that people are posed to. But we're seeing none of that in relation to immigration detention. We're not hearing anything. It's the same in prisons as well. So there's a clear division between the kind of transparency and protective measures that are used in the Australian public that's really been brought to fore, you know, creating that distinction between two different sets of populations, to put it really in blunt terms.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, actually, I think it's very important. I say that on base of my experience, because I have been working with the many organizations for many years. I think this question, you know, first I should say that as an academic, I think the academics should do their duty, and their duty is to do research, study, and write and publish. And I think that is important. That is what the academics should do. But if in terms of activities, so I should mention that the organizations and as a structure, I think are not able, and they are not capable to create change, because some of these organizations actually are getting funds from the government. It means that the government is giving them money, support them, and they are working against the government. And that doesn't make sense. You know, some of them are like this, and some of them are rely on donation by people. But generally, I don't believe that we be able to create change through the organizations. I mean, the humanitarian organization and the NGOs. They are only, they are useful in different way. And I think I believe in individuals. And I think that we should rely on the individuals. We should rely on the community, on people, on artists and these people, because through a bureaucratic system, you cannot create change. And in some ways, it is a big claim, but I believe that these organizations become a part of the system, and the system tolerate them. The system already accept that there are some organizations who are working in this field. And that's why I think I don't ask people to don't donate to the organizations, but I think that if someone wants to donate or do something, it's better that they support the artists, support the people who are working to challenge the narrative, rather than the organizations who are a bureaucratic system. That is only my experience. And of course, many people are not agree with this.
Great, thanks, Behrooz. I think that answers one of the earlier questions as well, where someone was talking about the organisations. So that's great, thank you. I'll see if we can fit all this in and try and finish off by 1:30. So there was just a question around this one, which I thought was quite interesting from Marjorie. Does Manus Prison Theory investigate any ways of infiltrating or opening up legal and political spaces where gatekeeping language excludes so many people, which I think probably goes to many, I'm thinking of Maria's paper, but many of the other papers around how do we look at a system that is deliberately excluding and devising these spaces? How do we break these spaces apart and actually come up with something new? Omid, please.
Just really briefly, one of the things that remains with me and I've been thinking about a lot is Behruz's analysis that what happens to people, particularly in sites such as Manus Prison or in Nauru, and also in Indonesia, that they're in between law and lawlessness. So they're in this particular space where law is used against them. It's used to punish them. It's used to limit their possibilities of for mobility and for freedom and security. But at the same time, there are no laws that apply to them. So they're in this kind of in-between space. And one of the I've been inspired by different kinds of legal campaigns to support people in detention, and these have been fantastic. But we also have to recognise, I think, the fact that law can change so quickly, and it has. So, for instance, the Medivac bill was excellent. It helped secure a path for many people to receive medical treatment. But those same people are now about 1 year in immigration detention onshore in hotels, and that, you know, in my interactions with them, and I'm translating for a number of people and working with a number of people in the onshore sites after being transferred, and they say that their health conditions and also just their general well-being and their environment was better when they were in the offshore sites. I know that's not the right way to compare it, but in general, the Medivac bill worked against them in that sense, and they've developed a lot of other conditions as a result of being in the closed conditions, particularly during during coronavirus, from being onshore. And so I think using these legal strategies is important, but also having a kind of long-term view of how things could go wrong and how the system could end up morphing and transforming to avoid accountability and to continue its attack on refugees, its war on refugees.
I feel very reluctant to make this call of shall we finish there, but I'm so conscious of everyone has already put in half an hour over the time that we'd allocated, and I really appreciate everyone staying and discussing. I mean, I don't know, did you want to just say a couple of sentences carrying on from what you're saying, just to sum it all up, and we might finish with your lines? What do you think?
Just thank you to everyone for all the support and for your focus, and really essentially just for being comrades, just being there for everyone, and for making this a central concern for so many years. And there's so many people to thank who have been doing excellent work for so many years that have really inspired me, have inspired Behruz and other people working in this space. I think maybe just closing comments would be, keep an eye out for the work that refugees are doing, or people who have experienced displacement and exile are doing in so many different forums. There's just so much inspirational work being out there and coming out, and I think to leverage that, to use that in really creative ways, to do things to challenge the system in ways that the system doesn't expect, that it can't predict. When Behruz and I were working on No Friend But the Mountains, we were really realistic. We thought that this is not going to end up changing anything, and it's really for the future. It's for future generations. It's a duty to history. It's to document what's happening. But we were unexpectedly, you know, so much of the success was unexpected. So, you know, now we've got this new belief that invest in people, believe in people, commit to people, and you'll be surprised at what kind of things will emerge and what kind of things can become possible. And let's keep building and let's keep organizing. That's, I think, the only thing I can finish with.
That's fabulous.
I think I should say something.
Yes.
Just 2 seconds. Omid, we expected but we didn't expect that happen very quickly. I mean that we imagine that one day many researchers and artists engage with our works because it is a body of works, but we didn't expect that happen very quickly. I think we should thank Victoria for giving that award. I think that had a huge impact. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Behrooz. Thank you, Omid, and thank you to all this amazing panel and speakers today. Just such a, like everyone has said, invigorating conversation and ideas flowing around, and I really appreciate. And thank you to everyone who stuck around right to the end in our audience as well. Apologies that we're so far over, but I hope it was worth staying around for the extra half hour. But thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate it.